However, our polls show that Trump has a 14-point edge over Kamala Harris on immigration. Excuse me.
What do you think each candidate needs to try to do in order to sway undecided voters?
Well, I would think in J.D. Vance's case, Jess, that one thing he has to do is get off the sort of offbeat rhetoric like childless cat ladies and, you know, weird stories about immigrants that aren't true. I think he needs to present himself as a serious candidate with serious policy ideas. And I think Tim Walz has to show that beyond being everybody's social studies teacher, which is sort of the, you know, the affect he presents now, that he is also a serious candidate for office. So I think both of them need to behave themselves tonight.
All right, Wendy, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Wendy Benjaminson, she's a Washington senior editor for Bloomberg News, joining us from Washington, D.C. A little bit of a preview of the vice presidential debate, which begins, that will be on tonight, and we'll have full coverage on Bloomberg Television, Radio, Balance of Power, expanded coverage from 8 p.m. to 11 p.m. Wall Street time. So I'll have the preview, the debate, and then some
That's right.
Some commentary afterwards.
I hear they're not automatically muting each side, but they have the ability to go in and step in. It's a little bit different than the presidential debate.
Yeah, it might get a little feisty perhaps, so we'll have to see how that plays out. But again, it's probably the last time, as you mentioned, these two campaigns are going to go head-to-head together against each other on stage. We'll have more. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, Jess Menton in for Alex Steele. I'm Paul Sweeney, live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio, streaming live on YouTube as well. It is Hispanic Heritage Month, and every day at this time we are celebrating significant moments in Hispanic heritage. Now with your installment for October 1st, here's Bloomberg's Sebastian Escobar.
Thank you, Paul. On this day in 2016, the documentary film Hamilton's America, featuring Puerto Rican singer-songwriter and actor Lin-Manuel Miranda, premiered at the New York Film Festival.
Our show opened on Tuesday and the world blew up.
I have more than once compared Lynn to Shakespeare.
I knew that Hamilton was going to change my life.
The revolutionary Broadway musical known as Hamilton took the world by storm with its diverse young cast and use of hip-hop music to tell the story of America's history. For the Latinx community, the overwhelming success of Hamilton showcased the importance of representation on the Broadway stage. And for Lin-Manuel Miranda, the musical and subsequent documentary proved that Latinos can achieve the American dream, even if they are already American. That's today in Hispanic Heritage. I'm Sebastian Escobar, Bloomberg Radio.
Sebastian, thank you so much. We appreciate it. I'm a huge fan of Hamilton. My kids, it came out when my kids were just kind of getting into Broadway, and it just totally turned them on to Broadway.
Oh, it's great.
We were singing that thing across in our house for like weeks. And
The Sweeney Clan.
Yes, playing nonstop on reel here.
I love that.
All right, Boeing, some news here. Maybe weighing to raise at least $10 billion in stock. Because why? They got a cash flow problem here. And they're not delivering as many planes as they need to. It's definitely a challenge for them. So they did go to the bond market, and they're considering going to the equity market. Let's see if that's enough. George Ferguson, senior aerospace defense analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence, joins us. George, again, this is something you've talked to us about in the past, that the company may need to go to the equity market and raise some equity. The stock's down 40% year to date. Ideally, not a good time to raise money at this valuation, but what do you make of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the strike is sort of dragged on enough, and they have to be concerned about having enough cash to continue to run the business that they're ready to do whatever it takes, right, to shore up their position. I guess it kind of gives me a sense that maybe they think the strike's going to last longer than maybe even we anticipated originally, and so you got to do what you got to do, I guess.
And we do know that Boeing is on the cusp of seeing its credit rating cut to junk here. What's the likelihood that we could see this happening soon?
I mean, I think that, again, if this strike drags on, you're starting to get to the point where I think once you get past a month where you're probably doing more damage to the supply chain. And so losing a month due to the strike, that doesn't mean it's just going to take you a month to sort of recapture where you were previously. I think losing a month means you put the suppliers in much more strain. Maybe it means it's 6 weeks, 7 weeks worth of recovery. So the further it drags on, I think the more the rating agencies have to think about when are they going to really bounce back to profitability and generate some decent cash, and they've got to keep sort of pushing it out at a multiple of the time the strike has gone on. And so, that's what I think the real challenge here. I think I'm not the credit analyst, but I think that the credit agencies, if we drag on again past a month, I think they have to really start to think about whether they can hold Boeing in a band that, frankly, I think they weren't really in anyways. But the credit agencies are trying to look through the cycle a bit here.
The stock's actually up 3.5% on the news today, so maybe that investment-grade credit rating is more important than maybe some dilution here. George, where are we in terms of these negotiations here? We're in week 3. Any movement there?
Not what we're hearing. I think you've heard the same as we did, that another offer came out. It looked like I think it was about a 30% increase. Looks like the union wasn't very interested. I think if you're Boeing right now, what I understand is a lot of these union members got one of their last paychecks either at the very end of September or beginning of October here. And so I think now what you're really trying to do is figure out what the reserve, what the union really, how far they're willing to go, right? Whether they're as girded as they say they are to keep going into a world where they're just not getting paychecks, right? And so maybe here we're in a bit of a who knows, sort of the chicken phase where Boeing says, look, we can push this further, and let's see how long you can't take a paycheck and see how much the union has saved up. And I think the challenge here really is, right, Boeing has to live with whatever cost structure they ultimately agree to, right? And so as much as they just want to get back and start building airplanes, they also have to be very careful about what the long-term effects are on their financials. It's really challenging right now for Boeing in their financial position to have to do this, but they've got to think about the long term here.
All right, George, thank you very much. We appreciate it. George Ferguson, Senior Aerospace, Defense, and Airlines Analyst for Bloomberg Intelligence. Boeing, the stock is up 2.25% here today to $155, but it did touch a 52-week low here earlier in the day. The stock is off 40% year to date. So the question is, you weigh the benefits of maybe preserving your investment-grade credit rating versus the equity dilution that your equity shareholders will deal with. So that's the issue for Boeing.
And looking over to the broader markets once again, the S&P 500 actually coming a little bit off the lows. Earlier this morning, it fell as much as 1.4%. Now it's down about 0.9%. Nonetheless, it's still on pace for its worst day in about a month since September 6th here. So people keeping a close eye on that. And of course, like we were mentioning earlier, you're seeing energy companies gain on this. And then also utilities companies, more of the defensive kind of income bond proxy-like type of sectors that do serve and obviously dividend-paying type corners of the market holding up better than others. But of course, when it comes to those riskier assets of the equity market, like technology, discretionary, those are the ones getting hit the most today.
Yep, absolutely. So we'll keep an eye on that. Geopolitical risks, the dock strike. There's a lot of issues out there for these markets to deal with outside of, income statements, balance sheets, and earnings and PEs and stuff like that. Balance of Power with Joe Matthew in New York City. That comes up right now.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
This time the microphones will not be muted. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as the presidential campaign centers on New York City for tonight's vice presidential debate. We'll, of course, bring it to you live when it happens. The backdrop is more complicated today, though. A major dock workers strike taking effect along the East Coast. And, of course, word from the U.S. that Iran is planning an imminent ballistic missile attack against Israel. This hour, we'll have a live report from Elizabeth, New Jersey, where things are awfully quiet at the port, and we'll discuss the strike with Seth Harris from the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. Bloomberg's David Gora joins later this hour to talk about the stakes for tonight's debate, and we'll have our signature panel with us as well, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, along for the hour. And we start, as always, on Wall Street with a lot to cover. Charlie Pellet has that for us right here in New York. Hey, Charlie.
And hello there, Joe Matthew. Once again, big warm welcome to New York and lots of moving parts to this market on the first trading day of the fourth quarter. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red right now. We begin, though, with developments out of Washington. According to a senior White House official, the U.S. has indications that Iran is preparing to launch a ballistic missile attack against Israel in the next 12 hours. The U.S. is actively supporting preparations to defend Israel, according to the official, against the possible strike. The warning comes after Israeli forces moved into southern Lebanon in an escalation of its campaign against Tehran-backed Hezbollah. Stocks lower with the S&P down 1% right now, retreating from yesterday's record at 57.03. The Dow is down 0.4% right now, down 162 points. NASDAQ down by 1.8%. 10-year 3.71%, the 2-year 3.59%. Gold is advancing $28 the ounce to $26.62, up by 1.1%. Crude, major story today with West Texas Intermediate crude surging on heightened Mideast tensions, up now by 3.9%. We've got WTI 70.81 a barrel. First trading day of the fourth quarter with the U.S. presidential election right around the corner. So what about the market outlook given the calendar? Carol Schleif is Chief Investment Officer at BMO Family Office.
We, like so many other people, had expected there to be more volatility this year in general, but particularly coming into this fall season, because it is very traditional to have volatility going into an election season, especially as the polls swing, as fall gets underway.
Schleif was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Television. CVS Health shares down 1.6%. CVS planning to cut roughly 2,900 jobs to reduce costs, and according to the company, as it conducts a strategic review of its operations that includes a possible breakup. And one political note here in New York, Mayor Eric Adams' inner circle getting even smaller. Tim Pearson, a controversial senior advisor to the first-term mayor, says he will resign, becoming the 5th senior member of the administration to step down or announce plans to leave within the past month. Recapping, stocks are trading lower right now with the S&P down by 1%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now wherever you get your podcasts. That's a Bloomberg Business Flash. His mic definitely on. Once again, your host, Joe Matthew.
Thank you so much, Charlie Pellet. Actually, it seems like a pretty textbook reaction today in the markets, right? We've got oil up, oil stocks are up, defense stocks are up. Shipping stocks are down.
And look at you. You want to talk markets, and I want to talk the debate, because there's a long day for you and Kaylee Lyons, by the way. Yeah. Yes, and among some of those shippers, AP Moller-Maersk out of Germany, that is down 5.3%. Hapag-Lloyd, actually, they're the ones out of Germany, down by 4.7%.
Appreciate it, as always. In the flesh, Charlie Pellet, of course, well, I guess I'm the one in the flesh. He's always here. Live at World Headquarters in New York. Welcome to the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. Yeah, it's only Tuesday. It's debate night, and we're going to be talking a lot about some of these major stories here. We're spinning a lot of plates, and they're pretty heavy plates. With reporting from Bloomberg, as you've been hearing, that Iran is planning an imminent ballistic missile strike against Israel. We've, of course, got the dock workers strike that Danny Berger is going to bring us up to date on. And all of these stories are going to be part of the backdrop for this debate tonight that'll happen in prime time and will likely be the last debate of this cycle with Tim Walz and J.D. Vance here in downtown New York. Danny Berger is across the river in New Jersey once again today. In fact, at the Elizabeth Marina, with 45,000 dock workers now on strike. Now, Danny brought us up to date on the stakes yesterday, and she's back with us at the port here to bring us up to date on what has transpired since midnight. Danny, we learned a lot from your reporting yesterday, and we're hearing estimates in the $4 billion a day range here for the cost of this strike. What are you learning?
Well, Joe, it does seem like we are inching ever closer to a deal. To be clear, we are not there yet. Conversations happened into the 11th hour of this strike. So just to give you an idea of where we were this time yesterday, it was the International Longshoremen's Association, the union, demanding a 77% pay increase over the next 6 years. We have got an offer from USMX, that is the United States Marine Association. They say that they are willing to pay 50% over the next 6 years. It seems like the other side has come down too. The union now says that they are willing to accept 61.5%. So getting closer. We are still not there yet, Joe. One of the other sticking points continues to be automation. We heard from the employers saying that they would keep the current language in the contract about automation, which does prevent it from going forward. Is that enough? That is still a question.
Okay. Now, I'm glad you mentioned that, because automation is a little bit more difficult to quantify. What would that look like in a deal, in a form that would make the dock workers happy?
Well, the dock workers want it banned in all forms of any of it being added, whether it be autonomous or semi-autonomous. Joe, this issue really goes back to the summertime. There was in Alabama, it appeared to be that some of the docks were using automated technology for unloading, which at the time the workers said violated the contract. That's part of the reason why today's talks, why yesterday's talks have gotten so contentious. They basically say any move forward on automation they do not want. They do not want the post here on the east, on the Gulf Coast, to look like it does in Asia or Amsterdam. They, again, just want it stalled at its current level. Many say that that's not possible, but maybe you need upskilling. You need different things to help folks keep their job, even if that automation does take place.
Understood. We spoke last evening, Danny, with the Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg, specifically asked him about contingency plans, knowing how much we're talking about here in terms of an economic impact, the number of ships that pass through these ports and the containers that they are carrying. Here's what he said about contingency plans, knowing that this strike is now in effect.
had another convening that my colleagues at DOT brought together with about 60 different players across logistics and supply chains to make sure that we're mapping everything and anything that needs to happen in terms of adjustments or flexibilities across road, rail, and different ports across the United States. But certainly, the best thing that could happen is for the parties to quickly come to terms.
And it sounds like, Danny, they might do that based on what you're telling us here. The conversations are still underway, but as long as this strike is in place, what do we know about our ability to reroute shipments to try to make up for the loss of activity on the East Coast?
Well, Joe, the best plans and the ones that were already put in place were ones that basically front ran this. And we did indeed see that. There were record shipments coming into these United States before the strike because we knew about this date. We knew that October 1st would come and the contract would run out. So that is one method that a lot of really urgent type materials that needed to come into the U.S. did. They extended the hours of all the ports. When it comes to rerouting, Joe, the options are not good. The West Coast can only handle some 16% of what comes through the East Coast. In Canada, they can't handle much. Same goes for Mexico. There's the possibility of air traffic, air freights, but their capacity isn't great either. It's much less than the coast, and so many people are ordering via e-commerce that those are mostly booked up. So for now, the administration needs to hope that the plans that they already put in place are enough and that they resolve quickly, like you heard there from Secretary Pete Buttigieg.
Bloomberg's Danny Berger, an absolute authority on this story, and with us from the marina in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Danny, thank you so much for a second day of coverage here. Of course, this all began at 12:01 a.m. It was a midnight deadline, and we have passed it. I want to add the voice of Seth Harris, of course, someone we talk to a lot about all issues, including labor, and this is a precarious moment for the administration. And of course, on the campaign trail, a new item, another reason to be talking about organized labor in this cycle. Seth is senior fellow at the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University and was one of Joe Biden's top labor advisors, former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Labor. Seth, it's great to have you back. The big picture here, is this about pay and benefits, or is it about automation?
It's about both, Joe. The union feels very strongly, and its members are quite angry about the fact that the companies earned a Mount Everest of profits during the pandemic. They are still highly profitable, and the workers want their fair share. The workers worked through the pandemic. They put themselves at grave risk. They want a fair share of those profits, and the only way to do that is with higher wages and with better benefits. Automation is about job protection. They want to make sure that they're not going to lose their jobs, and the union is not going to lose members over time. So they have fairly strong automation language in their existing contract, but automation is always changing. Technology is always changing. So they want to strengthen that language to make sure that we're not going to see meaningful displacement of longshore workers.
We know that Joe Biden has chosen not to invoke the Taft-Hartley Act. Seth, he could have demanded an 80-day cooling off period under that law. We know that the president has been open to these ideas with what we saw, of course, in the rail strike 2 years ago. Are you surprised he did not do this? And what does that tell us about the administration's posture here?
No, I'm not surprised at all. You know, in seeking an injunction in court to shut down a strike takes power out of workers' hands, and Joe Biden's entire presidency has been about putting more power into workers' hands. So I'm not surprised at all. The national freight rail strike, and also to some extent the West Coast negotiations, the West Coast dock worker negotiations, occurred in a different period in our history when supply chains were extremely vulnerable and there was a grave risk of lasting damage to the economy. Well, supply chains have healed. They're doing just fine. This is certainly going to have, the strike will have an economic effect if it goes on for a good long time. But I don't think supply chain infrastructure is going to be damaged by the strike. And the president sees it that way as well.
Well, that's really important, Seth. Maybe you can tell our viewers and listeners a little bit more on the why, because there are a lot of bad and recent memories about these supply chain hiccups going through COVID. We finally unsnarled so many of these lines that people are worried that we're going to go back into another inflationary period. The Christmas gifts aren't going to show up on time, and we see this whole movie all over again. How is it different now?
Well, remember what happened during the pandemic. Americans stopped buying or slowed dramatically the buying of services, right? We weren't going out for meals. We weren't going out to the movies. We weren't going out to bowl. Instead, what we did is we spent a tremendous amount of money on goods. And so a large amount of goods were coming into the United States. At the same time, workforces around the world were being affected by COVID. There were people who were sick and dying. There were people who were not able to go into work. There were people who had caregiving responsibilities and weren't able to work. And so the system just was not working well. The private sector folks who run our supply chains just were totally and completely unprepared and didn't have contingencies. They had stripped their systems down in order to maximize profit. We're not there anymore. We don't have people who are out because of COVID. We don't have people who have child care responsibilities or elder care responsibilities unable to go to work. We have people whose work is being slowed down or stopped because of a strike. And when the strike ends, they'll be able to get back to work. Now, the strike ending is not going to immediately solve every problem. We're going to end up with a big backlog of cargo that has to come into the United States. Yep. And for every week of strike, it'll take 3 or 4 weeks to get the cargo moving again.
Okay. You might not be surprised to hear that Speaker Mike Johnson sees this differently than the Biden administration. He's out with a statement that says just one day of paused operations will have devastating consequences on the economy, and hardworking American families will feel the impact of higher prices, empty shelves, lost economic output. He's criticizing the administration here, Seth, for making life harder for everyone, he says, and the failure to encourage a resolution between the Longshoremen's Association Union and the U.S. Maritime Alliance will exacerbate economic pain. This is what we're going to hear in the debate tonight from J.D. Vance, right?
Well, that's an interesting problem that the Republicans have. Let me just say Mike Johnson is about as anti-union as you can be, so that's an easy position for him to take. But the Trump-Vance ticket has a little bit of a challenge here because President Trump tries to build on the constructive ambiguity in his career about his relationship with workers and his relationship with unions. He doesn't want to be perceived as a rabidly anti-union guy, even given the record of his administration, which was quite anti-union. And when he goes on with Elon Musk on Twitter Spaces, he sometimes lets his real inner Trump out. But J.D. Vance is in a difficult position because he is trying to portray himself and also his presidential candidate as friends of the working person, friends of unions, people who want workers to have power. So if you're going to shut down a strike and take power out of workers' hands, you have a lot of explaining to do. So I think J.D. Vance absolutely is going to attack President Biden and Vice President Harris by extension because there is a strike. I'm sure Governor Walz will defend them, but taking a position on what they would do, I think that's going to be pretty perilous.
Well, when you consider this action, and I don't know how long you think this is going to go on for, Seth, you add Boeing, there are questions about whether we're going to have, a hot labor winter here, just as people are getting ready to vote and get to the polls. What does it say about the administration, which of course has framed itself as the most union-friendly in American history, to find ourselves with 2 more labor actions walking up against this election?
Well, strikes are not failures. Strikes are not a sign either that the White House has failed or that collective bargaining has failed. They are a part of the collective bargaining process, and President Biden has been absolutely clear about this. The whole idea in collective bargaining is that private parties, management and labor, sit down at a table and work out their problems. And government doesn't have a role except to mediate and to try to keep the parties at the table. That's what's good about it. It's not a government solution. So the fact that the Boeing workers were unhappy with the amount of money that was offered to them by management, and justifiably so, and that the longshore workers are worried about their jobs and want to get a bigger share of the profits that their employers are getting, that's all part and parcel of a collective bargaining process. It's like democracy. It's not always pretty, but it doesn't mean that you want to shut it down and force people to work.
Got it. Seth, I'm glad you could join us today. Do you have a sense, by the way, I've got 30 seconds left. I don't want to cut you off, but are we talking days or weeks?
I think the move by USMX to raise their wage offer is a very good sign. The ILA responded by lowering their wage offer. I think that we could be looking at a deal in the next week and a half.
Really appreciate that, and that's coming from an expert. Seth Harris, great to see you, as always. Senior Fellow of the Burns Center for Social Change at Northeastern University. You're hearing just now from a voice that had the ear of Joe Biden. as a labor advisor in this White House. We'll have more on this with our panel coming up a little bit later on. We'll turn our attention as well to what's happening in the Middle East with breaking news today: Iran and an imminent ballistic missile attack, according to the U.S. This is Bloomberg.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. And Israel defense spokesman says an attack by Iran on Israel may be on a wide scale. It comes as a senior U.S. White House official says that the U.S. has indications Iran is preparing to launch a ballistic missile attack against Israel in the next 12 hours. Stocks lower across the board. Investors are retreating to safer corners of the market on indications that Iran is preparing to attack. We've got the S&P down 50 now, down 0.9%. The Dow down 126, a drop there of 0.3%. Both the Dow and the S&P pulling back from records. Nasdaq down 1.5%. 10-year 3.70%. The 2-year 3.59%. Gold surging 1.1%. Heightened tensions in the Middle East, 26.63 an ounce. And West Texas Intermediate crude up 3.9%, 70.84 a barrel. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. He's here in New York. Back we go once again. Your host, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Clearly, this story about Iran is hanging on the markets here. It's moving oil, it's moving stocks, and it's creating a lot of uncertainty as well in political circles here on this day that we're going to see a vice presidential debate here in New York. We want to get to what we know, though. This is important stuff as the U.S. says Iran is preparing to hit Israel with ballistic missiles. And it brings us back to what happened, of course, in April when the U.S. and other allies of Israel helped to defend the country, knocking down pretty much everything that Iran sent Israel's way. It could be a little bit different this time. And there has been quite a bit of concern, certainly along the Lebanon border, where we've seen cross-border skirmishes going on for months now, and then this most recent escalation. Bloomberg's Dan Williams, our Middle East reporter, is joining us right now from Israel with the latest on this. Dan, what are you hearing when we say imminent? Are we talking hours or days?
This really is a development that emerged only over the past 2 hours, with a U.S. official assessing that there could be an imminent ballistic missile attack by Iran on Israel. The Israelis weren't quick to confirm this. However, they did order the populace in much of the country to remain close to shelters, to avoid assembling in public. As of 10 minutes ago, the chief IDF spokesman has said that indeed a potentially major Iranian attack is expected on Israel, is expected imminently, and it may even be bigger or as big as the attack you alluded to back in April. Back then, there were some 300 projectiles fired by Iran at Israel. Around 100 or 105 were ballistic missiles. Those are very expensive. They're very lethal. They have large warheads. They fly very fast. They tend to break the atmosphere. They're potentially harder to intercept than drones or cruise missiles, which were part of the strike package back in April. So if indeed we're going to see a larger salvo, specifically of ballistic missiles, this could be a challenge for even Israel's advanced air defenses and even those of the foreign countries with which it has cooperated in aerial defense.
Well, you wonder to what extent we're actually putting this out in the public space to act as a deterrent potentially for what might happen. Dan, we're seeing a lot of headlines here, including Israeli police reporting a shooting attack in the Tel Aviv area. Israel says it killed a Hezbollah commander in the Beirut strike that we just witnessed. You're in Jerusalem. What's it like on the streets there now?
Certainly, these events appear to be cascading today, as they have in the last 3 weeks, with an escalation of the Israeli offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon. But it's worth remembering that Israel has been on an open war footing for almost a year, since October 7th, 2023, when Hamas blindsided the Israelis with a cross-border rampage from the Gaza Strip in the south of the country. Since then, Israel has mounted a crushing counteroffensive in Gaza. There has been attacks on Israel by Hezbollah in Lebanon and by other Iranian proxy militias elsewhere in the region. Effectively, Israel's been in what it describes as a 7-front war, 7 different fronts. But those fronts include the Palestinians of the West Bank. And now it would appear, if indeed this event you alluded to in Tel Aviv is political violence rather than criminal, the initial reports from police, they've called it a terrorist attack. They've spoken of as many as 10 casualties. That would indicate that the violence, that the tensions are leaking into Israel itself, where there is a pretty delicate fabric of coexistence between the majority Jews and the minority Arab public.
You were up, I believe, near the Lebanon border earlier today, Dan, with some of your reporting. What did you see when you were there?
I was brought up there to the IDF Northern Command. This is a very large base, about 12, 15 kilometers from the Lebanese border, where the Israelis coordinate military actions in Lebanon and Syria. I was there with a number of journalists, both foreign and Israeli, because the IDF went public with what it says is low-signature commando raids into Lebanese territory, going back as far as November of last year. It says there have been more than 70 of those, and those were to gather intelligence, to just detect and destroy Hezbollah emplacements, to find and capture or destroy on-site Hezbollah weaponry, everything from rifles to anti-tank weapons to 15 tons of high explosives. Now, why did these Israelis go public with that today?
Yeah.
Well, because overnight they sent in a large force on the ground into Lebanon, something that alarmed the Lebanese, something that alarmed the rest of the region, certainly the United States. And I think what the Israelis are trying to say is, listen, this is actually more of the same. We've been going in on the ground for many months now. This is a higher level, a greater scale, because it's necessitated by the Hezbollah infrastructure across the border. That does not necessarily mean this is an invasion. It's simply a higher grade of incursion, and we've had a lower grade of incursion until now, which we're now telling you about.
The semantics are awfully important here. Dan, great reporting. I really do appreciate your staying up late for us here. It's been a very big day listening to Bloomberg's Dan Williams, Middle East reporter, and now live from Jerusalem after what he saw at that IDF post closer to the Lebanese border. We'll, of course, keep tabs on this story as we make our way through the day here. Watch the terminal, watch the website, stay with us here on Bloomberg Radio. This, of course, is going to be, I can only assume, part of the conversation in the vice presidential debate tonight. That's why we called Tim O'Brien, not only because I'm in New York and I like to check in with Tim when I can, but it's debate night. And wow, we've got some doozies here with the dock workers strike, with the situation in Israel. He's, of course, Bloomberg Opinion's senior executive editor. And Tim, it's great to see you. Thanks for being patient with us here as we get a sense of what's happening. Does this advantage either candidate? Is there an incumbency liability here for Kamala Harris if this does tip off into a wider war?
Look, I think if you have a regional war in the Middle East, people are going to want to know how the United States is going to respond as a steward of global security and as a rational entity in an irrational world. And I think voters are going to default to some of their biases as it matters throughout this election. Where independent voters and moderates land on this, I think will be consequential. And I don't know how someone looks to Donald Trump in a moment like this as a rational actor. There's an experienced team in the White House in a perilous moment. It's a team that's tried to shepherd a very perilous situation along for quite a while now. To change horses in the middle of that is perilous, but who knows what voters are going to think about.
His supporters would say, though, that this is a strong man, that we need a strong man right now who is definitive, and they will point back to say that in the Trump administration, there were no new wars. We hear that line a lot. You're going to hear J.D. Vance refer to forever wars tonight on that stage, aren't you?
Well, there are forever wars because people are forever warful, and human nature isn't going to get changed by a president. I think, Vladimir Putin, I don't think believed that Donald Trump would check his behavior. I don't think she believed, at different points that it mattered who was in the White House in terms of who checked his behavior. These are muscular, aggressive, authoritarian leaders who have designs on surrounding territories, and the United States needs to be vigilant and strong about that. Donald Trump isn't deeply informed about foreign policy. Donald Trump's never had a great interest in it. And he's, I think, shown on the campaign trail thus far that he's not actually presenting real-world solutions to any of these issues he's saber-rattling.
Well, of course, he won't be there tonight. And isn't it something that we have, this apparently will be the last word? The last debate of the cycle is the Veep debate? Looks like that's the case. So these two candidates are carrying a lot of water for their bosses, aren't they, tonight?
They are. I don't know how much Veep debates have ever really mattered.
No, right.
But we're in a theatrical moment as much as anything else. So there's a lot of interest in how these two gentlemen are going to stand up towards one another. I think it's interesting because they both come from authentic working class roots. They have very different views about how to help working class people and what the American dream is and how to rescue the middle class from various fallbacks over the last couple of decades. And I think they're both probably going to be truth squatting one another to within an inch of their lives. Vance
the moderators won't be.
The moderators won't be, which is why it's going to fall to the candidates.
That's right.
And Vance isn't moderating his own statements on the campaign trail. I mean, over the last few days, he's invested a lot in, I think, spewing things that aren't factually correct, but lean into their campaign goals.
I want to hear from, yesterday there was this back and forth about whether Governor Kemp, the governor of Georgia, could get Joe Biden on the phone. It's not just the dock workers strike in Israel, it's also a natural disaster that creates the backdrop for this conversation tonight here. We did hear from Governor Kemp, finally. Apparently he did get Joe Biden on the phone, despite what Donald Trump said. Let's listen.
Just know that we will work in a bipartisan way on disaster relief in this state with our federal, state, and local partners. We have submitted our expedited emergency declaration. This is something that's very rare, but this will help us, and I feel certain it'll be approved by the president and our federal partners.
So this begs a couple of questions. I'm setting you up big time with 2 minutes left to our conversation here. The extent to which Donald Trump is saying things that are clearly not true. Is he getting a phone call at night? Somebody's, hey, did you hear that Kemp couldn't get Biden on the phone? Or is he actually just making it up? And more broadly, is the handling of this hurricane going to help decide the election?
The first question, Joe, I think he is just making it up. I don't think there's strategy.
He knows better, though.
I don't know that he knows better. Okay. I think he feels like he's in a corner, and over the last few weeks, he's been, creating things out of whole cloth. Waging a kind of culture war here, and essentially assembling myths and or lies to buttress this idea that the world is working in a different way than it actually
Harris wants
is.
to legalize fentanyl, for instance, things like that.
And she's mentally disabled.
Mentally disabled.
And that the Biden White House has had a poor response to Hurricane Helene.
Is it the people surrounding him, though? Because you know Donald Trump better than most. Or is he saying, you know what, I'm going to make this up right now?
No, I think the people surrounding him, the strategists, and the difference about this campaign initially compared to 2016 and 2020 is he had real pros in there who were thinking about trying to mount a rational tactical campaign. And at every turn, he's just done what he wanted, because that's essentially how he always operates. And you can do that on a golf course. You can't do that on a political campaign. And it's going, I think, to hurt him, because, again, it'll come back to how he's perceived by moderate independent voters.
Sure.
His base won't care. Democrats have already made up their mind. But I don't think moderate voters wondering to know what to do is going to feel comforted by.
Someday I need to see your Twitter notifications. Tim O'Brien on Bloomberg.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We begin with a developing story. Israel's IDF says rockets from Iran have been fired at Israel. This development comes after Israeli forces moved into southern Lebanon in an escalation of its campaign against Hezbollah. Again, the headline right now on the Bloomberg, Israel's IDF says rockets from Iran have been fired at Israel. Stay with Bloomberg for the very latest on this developing story. U.S. market reaction. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. Stocks lower, retreating from yesterday's record with the S&P down 1%, now at 57.01. We've got the Dow down 209, down 0.5%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 321, drop now of 1.8%. 10-year 3.70%, the 2-year 3.57%. Gold is advancing 1.4%, 26.70 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude looking at a spike there up 4.4%. WTI now at 71.16 a barrel. So again, repeating our top story, Israel's IDF says rockets from Iran have been fired at Israel. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcast. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your host here, he is in New York, Joe Matthew.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Charlie Pellet watching the markets for us with news breaking before our eyes here. It's, of course, not often that we see a red headline like this with news from Israel, where the IDF indeed says rockets from Iran have been fired. We're also hearing the IDF use the term missiles. So we want to be as careful and accurate as we can here. A short time ago, missiles launched from Iran towards the state of Israel, and we did see as well a tweet from the IDF. All Israeli civilians are in bomb shelters as rockets from Iran are fired at Israel. We've been waiting for this, of course, for some time. Bloomberg reporting earlier today that a missile attack by Iran was imminent. And now here we are in the noontime hour, East Coast time, reporting that for you on Bloomberg. It does change the contours, potentially, of this debate tonight. Both vice presidential nominees here in New York, where we're broadcasting live, joined as well now by Bloomberg's David Gura, who, of course, has been at all of the debates so far, depending on the candidate. And back here in New York today, David, it's great to see you. We wonder the extent to which this is going to drive the conversation tonight. Geopolitics tend not to play a big role in these debates, certainly when it comes down to the running mates.
I expect it will, and it has to, just given how much focus has been on this. But you're right, in the past couple of debates, there have been moments devoted to foreign policy, but there hasn't been an event like this that I think kind of serves this up to the moderators and the candidates. You look at these two candidates, these two nominees, in complement, J.D. Vance, a junior senator from Ohio, not on Foreign Relations Committee, not on the Defense Committee. So an opportunity here for him perhaps to show his engagement with these issues and talk about what he might do were he to be the vice president, something like this were to happen. Tim Walz, who served on the Armed Services Committee when he was in the House, an opportunity for him in another way to kind of draw from that experience as well on the stage tonight. So just looking at these moderators, I should say lastly, Margaret Brennan, who hosts Face the Nation on CBS News, and of course is the State Department correspondent for CBS News as well, I imagine will lean into this as she comes up with her questions for the debate tonight, Joe.
That's got to be true. But there's so much also that these candidates have been preparing for outside of the geopolitical realm. And you wonder to what extent they're going to be talking not about the person across the stage from them, but the one at the top of the ticket, right? Tim Walz going after Donald Trump tonight. J.D. Vance is going after Kamala Harris. How much engagement do you think we see between the two of them on things like stolen valor or eating pets in Springfield?
I've been looking back on the debates that these two have done in the past at the state level, of course, and national level for J.D. Vance when he was running for Senate. And, J.D. Vance has engaged rather boisterously on the debate stage before. I think that we might see some of that tonight. I mean, we've listened to him as he's been campaigning, bring up stolen valor, engage with his military record and Governor Walz's as well. I suspect we might get some of that. I think an interesting factor of this debate is that the microphones will not be muted as they have been in the past two presidential debates. So there could be some real give and take here that will be audible to those watching and listening to the debate here on Bloomberg. I kind of wonder to what extent
they try to take advantage of that, right? Are they, I mean, this could be a brawl, is what you're saying.
I think that it could be. I mean, another X factor here, too, is that, Governor Walz has not done a national debate before. How does he comport himself? Right. We know that J.D. Vance, of course, he a law school graduate, seems like a spirited debater, likes to mix it up. And I mentioned Margaret Brennan before, a regular on Face the Nation as well. He has some familiarity with the way that she asks questions and how these unfold, and she'll be there, of course, with Nora O'Donnell, too. But I'm curious sort of how that shapes the way that he responds on the stage tonight.
And you know how the spin room works. I'm wondering if we're going to see the same players in there exactly. Donald Trump, I believe you were standing in the room when it happened, decided to go to the spin room himself. Maybe the candidates make an appearance later.
Yes, not expecting that Mr. Trump will be in the spin room here in New York, but that was a crazy moment to be sure down in Philadelphia. Look, I think that we had to return to some semblance of normalcy, sort of what tends to follow these debates or has followed them in cycles past. We didn't have that in Atlanta during that first debate, so I think that we are going to see that tonight. And there was kind of a fulsome defense of both candidates by surrogates on both sides after that one in Philadelphia.
Well, a rare moment to actually be in the same room as David Gura while we're talking on the air.
More often.
Really great to see you. Absolutely, and thanks. David's been on the air since before any of us woke up. By the way, David Gura, Bloomberg News correspondent, host of the Big Take podcast, live on Balance of Power. We need to assemble the panel. We've got a lot going on here. And Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis are both with us right now. Of course, Bloomberg Politics contributors. Jeannie, political science professor at Iona University. Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. All right, guys, here we are. The missiles are in the air. There's GLZ radio in Israel tweeting incessant alarms throughout the country. Iran launched more than 100 ballistic missiles at Israel. Bloomberg has not independently confirmed that piece of information, Rick, but what's going through your mind right now as these missiles are literally in the air?
Well, the first shot on goal is going to come from probably the USS Abraham Lincoln. They're stationed in the Gulf of Oman. They interdicted most of the missiles that were launched in the first attack that Israel did earlier Iran did earlier in the spring, in retaliation to the assassination of some of their Republican Guard leaders. And so I think that this is sort of the first line of defense for Israel. And then whatever gets past the Gulf of Oman and that level of scrutiny, their Iron Dome system will be lit up. My guess is, too, I wouldn't be shocked that there's additional missiles that'll be coming over from Lebanon to try and overwhelm the Iron Dome program. But I know the Israelis have been expecting this for days, and as we have too.
That's true, to the extent that we sent a few thousand additional troops to the region, Jeannie. We don't know much about what they're doing exactly, but the Pentagon is clearly geared up to relive what happened in April, if not more. How important is this for the Biden administration at this moment when we're actually in the act of voting right now? Kamala Harris is, of course, part of this White House.
Yeah, I mean, it's critically important. Number one, and most importantly, Joe Biden's administration, their approach has been de-escalate the situation. And of course, we are seeing exactly the opposite. We saw the barrage from Iran in April that you mentioned. That was 120 missiles. We're waiting to see how many are going out now. Is it going to be more? Are they going to strike any civilian sites? I mean, so many questions remain. And this is exactly opposite of what Joe Biden and the administration have been pushing forward to. And, I'm also reminded that you look back in recent American history, and there are many scholars who say that the Middle East situation has confounded every single president we've had for the last several decades. And you wonder, is this going to be the fallout for Joe Biden's administration again? And boy, oh boy, we're 35 days out from the election. As you mentioned, people are voting. Kamala Harris, the sitting vice president, and foreign policy is not seen by voters, at least, as a strong suit for this administration, whether it's the Middle East or Afghanistan. And I think we will hear J.D. Vance tonight say the world was safer when Donald Trump left office. That's right. And now we are in a very, trying and difficult situation. There's a lot that Tim Walz can come back on with that, but he is, in saying that, reflecting a feeling of many Americans without a lot of context to the world situation. So it's been, not a good moment for the Biden administration or the Harris campaign, as this is coupled on with the hurricane, the strike, and some of the other events of the last 72 hours.
I do want to mention that GLZ radio that I referred to is Army radio in Israel, reporting that Iran has launched over 100 ballistic missiles at Israel. The Israeli Defense Forces making that announcement for us here just in the last couple of moments in this 12 o'clock hour on the East Coast. Rick, Jeannie makes a pretty good point here. The narrative is
going to be very easy for J.D. Vance. This is a more dangerous world because of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. What does Tim Walz say in reaction?
Yeah, I think that my guess is he'll talk about the full-throated defense of Israel that the Biden administration has given, much into some criticism within his own party, but there's very little distance that you could create between Joe Biden and Israel today. And the counter to that too is, former President Trump has criticized Bibi Netanyahu throughout portions of this conflict, and so on that score alone, I think that's important. But I think what Walz really needs to do is think big, and say, this kind of activity in defense of democracy and freedom is exactly what the U.S. stands for, and be a little Reagan-esque. I don't know if Democrats can be Reagan-esque. I mean, maybe it's just not in their gene pool. But I think that you want to go big on this and not sit there and get into a tit for tat about, whether or not Ukraine's winning or losing a war in Europe, and whether or not Bibi Netanyahu is going to still be prime minister 6 months from now. I mean, I think all that is just a pit. So go big or go home, Walz.
Does he have that in him, Jeannie? We know that he's never been in a national debate like this before, and he's been trying to lower the bar, telling people he's nervous about it. Can Tim Walz deliver that message?
I think he can. He is not a newbie. He's the sitting governor. He was in the House of Representatives. He isn't lowering expectations. I did see some of that debate he did with Scott Jensen, and it's, not the greatest performance you'd ever seen, but this is a whole new ballgame. He is well prepared. By the same token, it sounds like J.D. Vance, unlike Donald Trump, is well prepared as well. He's a very disciplined debater. So this is an uphill battle for Tim Walz. I think he can absolutely do it. I think one thing he's got to be very, very clear on, he can't get into a back and forth on his own record. He's got to be talking about defending Kamala Harris and projecting Kamala Harris's vision of the world. And there is a lot to say on foreign policy. Just to add to Rick's list, another thing to talk about are our alliances around the world. Joe Biden, whatever you think of his foreign policy, has done a very good job of working with our allies around the world to strengthen democracy. He's also the first president to publicly talk about the fact that in the 21st century, democracy and autocracy are in battle, and democracy needs to win. We didn't hear a lot of that, so he's also brought that to the forefront, and we're seeing that played out today in this. So there's a lot that you could say about the foreign policy, and he's also got to, quite frankly, show that Kamala Harris is not Joe Biden. She's got a very different vision of all of this.
Well, there's a big menu of options on issues to talk about here. Rick, of course, the candidates are doing their last-minute prep before they get out on the stage. To what extent is geopolitics on the minds of Americans versus a very long list of other issues, from the economy, inflation, to abortion, to this dock workers strike that also started today?
Yeah, this is a crowded moment. When you think about what voters are going through in Georgia and North Carolina, you can only assume that the only thing they have on their minds right now is, rebuilding their communities and healing from this devastating storm. And so let's just take those two aside and say, you know what, they get special exemption from having to watch a vice presidential debate that might right now seem meaningless to them. I'd say as the rest of the country tunes in, I think that voters have a tendency to follow the headlines. And this is a big moment in the Middle East. You can't find a newspaper that didn't lead with what's going on the Lebanon border with Israel right now. And so I think that candidates have to, they got to live in the moment a little bit, right? As Jeannie said, 35 days ago, and if everyone in the country is talking about, Israel's attack on Lebanon, then you better have something to say about it.
Yeah.
And I think that the idea of missing this opportunity would be too important. And so I would suspect that these candidates will lean in on it tonight.
Well, we're going to be doing this together, of course, Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzano, along for our special coverage here that'll begin at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The debate starts at 9, and our panel will be back in our second hour with a lot more breaking news. As we've been reporting here, the missiles are in the air. Dozens, maybe about 100 from reports inside Israel, from Iran toward Israel. We're following this in real time, and we'll have an update coming up next from our national security team, conversations with Congressman Jake Auchincloss, next on Bloomberg.
politics to the world of business. This is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
The missiles are in the air, launched by Iran toward Israel. Welcome to the fastest show in politics as Iran makes good on reports of an imminent attack. It has now been confirmed by both sides. And it, of course, happens as the vice presidential candidates gather today in New York, where we're broadcasting live for what will be their only debate of the cycle. I'm Joe Matthew alongside Kaylee Lyons at World Headquarters here in New York. And Kaylee, this debate tonight just got more complicated.
Well, absolutely. The Middle East is going to be the topic on everyone's mind, as Iranian state TV is saying this was just the first wave of an attack against Israel. Israel's military said that first wave has included 100 missiles being fired at the country. And remember, Joe, this is the second time this year we've seen Iran try to hit Israel directly. If we think back to the missiles and drones, the hundreds of them that were sent back in April, of course, those were largely intercepted. The question is going to be what kind of defense Israel and its allies, including the United States, are going to be able to put up against this attack.
That's true, knowing as well that the U.S. has surged troops and material into the region over the past couple of weeks in anticipation, Kaylee, of this very moment. A few thousand additional men and women, of course, from our armed services are in the region. We've got a carrier strike group on loan from the Pacific, and this is going to be a moment. It could be happening right now. We'll, of course, be reporting on this in real time, remembering we had hours between launch and delivery in that April attack that you mentioned, Kaylee. This is going to be quite a day.
Yeah, absolutely. Iranian state TV now saying that they're aiming at security and military targets in Israel. Also saying that if Israel responds, it will face attacks. So we'll have you fully covered on this hour. We'll get the latest from our national security team and Bloomberg's Ian Marlowe, who covers foreign policy for us in D.C. We'll also be speaking about this with a few members of Congress. Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischman and Democrat Jake Auchincloss will be joining us this hour.
That's indeed all true. We have a lot to talk about, and our panel is in place. Rick Davis and Jeannie Shanzana, who will be part of our coverage tonight with special coverage of the presidential, I should say, vice presidential debate starting at 8 p.m. Eastern time. Let's get up to date on the markets, though, right? This is actually a major market mover, what's happening right now in the Middle East. Charlie Pellet has that for us here in New York. Charlie?
Thank you very much indeed. Let's recap, reset. Here are the headlines right now from the Bloomberg Professional Service. As we have been reporting, Iran has fired ballistic missiles at Israel. This according to the Israel Defense Ministry. Iran state TV describes it as the first wave of missiles. Iran also says Israel will face attacks if it responds. Now, oil is surging right now. We've got West Texas Intermediate crude up almost 5%, back above $71 a barrel, $71.49 right now on WTI. Brent, the global benchmark, up now by 4.6%, above $75.02. So oil is surging. The direct involvement of OPEC member Iran in the conflict may increase the possibility of oil supply disruptions in the region. S&P 500 index lower. U.S. stocks trading down. S&P retreating from a record, down 1.1%. We've got the Dow down 0.6%. The NASDAQ Composite Index particularly hard hit, down 1.8% right now, down 331 points. 10-year, 3.71%. The 2-year, 3.58%. Spot gold now up 1.2%, 26.66 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude surging 5.1% right now, 71.62 a barrel. So again, repeating our top story headlines from the Bloomberg Professional Service: Iran has fired ballistic missiles at Israel. This according to the Israel Defense Ministry. Our coverage will continue now on Bloomberg Television and Radio, and for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Balance of Power continues. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. Connecting what's happening geopolitically with the market action, as certainly you are seeing, especially in the oil markets, this news of Iran sending missiles toward Israel percolating through the markets. And of course, it's likely to show up on the debate stage as well. We have to keep in mind, too, Joe, the context with which this is all happening. Israel in the last 24 hours launching limited ground operations into Lebanon for the first time since 2006 in the aftermath of course, the killing of the Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. All of these conversations around escalation we've been having for weeks now as we've been watching the trading of fire between Israel and Lebanon on that northern border, now resulting in direct conflict between Iran and Israel.
Well, we are lucky to have Ian Marlowe with us from our national security team in Washington. Of course, Kaylee, we've talked to Ian repeatedly in the walk up to this moment, and now it's actually happening. Ian, thanks for taking some time out of your reporting to join us here. As we understand, the first wave, as it's being described by Iran State TV, the first wave of missiles is in the air. Do we have any sense of how long it will take for them to arrive at their targets and what might come next?
Yeah, there are news sources and others, officials in Israel now saying that there's been around 200 missiles fired at Israel. There are some reports suggesting already that many of them are being intercepted or failing, falling out of the sky, not hitting their targets. So at the moment, we're still in obviously the very, very early stages of this. The attack is ongoing. Iran, as you said earlier, is saying that they're aiming here at military targets, not civilian targets. So that may do something in terms of the Israeli response if they're viewing it as more of an attack on military targets, which is kind of less severe in their view. But at the moment, everything is still unfolding. So, but as in April, when we saw the vast majority of those missiles and drones intercepted, that looks to be somewhat like what we're seeing from the early stages of this, at least as it stands now. And, the last time that was obviously interpreted as Iran looking like they were sending a big volley, but kind of calculating that it could be intercepted, and then you would have sort of de-escalation and not the wide-scale sort of broader war that everyone feared. So, this is one of those situations where people are trying to determine motivations. They're looking at what's happening. They're looking at what's being intercepted. But if there's some sort of, target hit, there's large-scale Israeli casualties, that sort of scrambles everything all over again.
Ian, do we know if any of this is coming from Hezbollah or if Hezbollah itself will be involved in this particular action, if it is going to be a multi-wave attack, as Iranian state TV seems to be implying, or has Iran essentially saying, we're taking things over from you, proxy, considering the blows you've been dealt over the course of the last several weeks?
It definitely seems, at least at the moment, to be more of the latter. This is a direct, Iranian strike at Israel. And, as you've seen and as you were kind of mentioning earlier, Israel's campaign against Hezbollah, over the last week, starting with the pager and walkie-talkie explosions that sort of took out their communications network and sort of maimed quite a few of their commanders and fighters, down to the strike on Friday against Nasrallah himself, and then escalating with these airstrikes and now the ground invasions. It's not clear what kind of capability Hezbollah still has, and the Iranian response itself sort of speaks to that. This is them coming to Hezbollah's aid, and just to kind of emphasize the dramatic change in the strategic calculus in the region right now. For months since October 7th, the U.S. has been warning Israel to stay away from Hezbollah because they had so many missiles, so many precision-guided, munitions that made the Hamas rockets that were coming out of Gaza, look like, child's toys to some degree. I mean, these were things that the U.S. and Israeli officials were very worried about. And, at the moment, we haven't seen anything from them. So I think that's, especially given the status quo, even just a few weeks ago before this campaign against Hezbollah really, got up to full speed, this is a kind of dramatic, reshuffling and scrambling of the strategic sort of geopolitical reality on the ground there between Israel and Hezbollah.
Just quickly, Ian, before we get to Congressman Chuck Fleischman's going to be joining us, a Republican from Tennessee, with his take on this and several other stories. Did Joe Biden just learn, as this takes place now, that any chance of a ceasefire deal has now vanished for the rest of his presidency?
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, a ceasefire deal between who now? Because the ceasefire deal in Gaza has been sort of on ice for months, if not, the last few weeks, certainly. And even just last week when the U.S. came out with this ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah, even that looks completely outdated given the strategic, the things that are unfolding on the ground right now. I mean, there was a ceasefire, then we had the strike on Nasrallah, then we have a sort of, a ground invasion or limited incursion, whatever you want to call it. You've got Israeli troops moving across the border. I mean, this is precisely the type of escalation the Biden administration has warned against. And so the Israeli success here is a bit challenging for the U.S. And we get the sense that the U.S., since they announced the ceasefire, last week, that attempt, in the middle of the United Nations General Assembly, trying to get everyone back down, trying to get the Lebanon conflict, get a lid on it, everything has changed since then. It's not even clear what the U.S. fully thinks about all of this, because they're warning against escalation, but at the same time seem at least privately pleased with the success that Israel has had, taking out some targets that the U.S. would have probably, to some degree, liked to take out themselves at some point along the line.
All right, Ian Marlowe, Bloomberg senior reporter covering foreign policy in Washington. Thank you so much. As we watch this breaking news, we want to add now the voice of a lawmaker. Republican Congressman Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee is joining us now here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Congressman, thank you very much for being with us. We, of course, want to talk to you about your district and how it has been impacted in the last few days by Hurricane Helene. But if we could begin with just the breaking news we are receiving, Iran having sent 100 missiles toward Israel in a direct attack. Donald Trump has suggested multiple times in the campaign trail that he sees the world on the brink of World War III. With that kind of language in mind, how do you view the developments we're getting in the Middle East today?
Well, if Donald Trump were president, none of this would be happening, plain and clear. Wouldn't be in Ukraine, we wouldn't have those problems, and we wouldn't have the situation we do in the Middle East. But let me segue away from politics, and as an appropriator, as a senior appropriator, and a strong supporter of Israel, condemn the Iranian attack unequivocally. There's been over 100, maybe as close to 200 missiles fired at Israel. We have got to put this in perspective. The gentleman who just spoke dealt very well with the factual details. The bottom line is we have an administration, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that has left the Middle East in a situation of despair. There's no respect for the White House right now. We have got to, as the strongest democracy and Israel's only true ally in the world, stand up, condemn what Iran is doing, make sure that Israel has every tool at its disposal to defend itself. This is an outrage that the Jewish state is under attack again today. Rest assured, Israel will respond several-fold in kind, and make sure that these things don't happen again.
Well, let's be specific, Congressman, and we'd love your thoughts on what we do need to give Israel to succeed. Is there another weapon system? Is there something that they haven't already received from the United States that could help to stop this?
So appreciate the question. As you recall, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I was the member on the House floor that basically saved the Iron Dome for Israel. The Squad and the Democrats were trying to do away with it in an NDAA bill. The Democratic leadership was lying about it, and then a member of the Squad got up on the floor and said, no, they were trying to do away with it. She was wrong, but she was telling the truth. And I condemned them then, and we saved Iron Dome. Iron Dome is critically important. As we hear that these missiles are being knocked down, they're being knocked down by a technology that is a purely defensive technology. It's about 90% successful. In addition to that, I do think we need to keep a military presence in the region. We are doing that. And I think we need to make sure that our allies in the Middle East that were part of the Abrams Accord, the Egyptians and other people who are friendly to the United States, the Jordanians, understand and unequivocally condemn Iran for this attack, this egregious attack on Israel. Israel has been under attack since October 7th, actually before, if you look at the rockets that have been flying in. But since October 7th, the world should condemn radical Islamic terrorism against Israel. The world did not do that. It was very tepid in their criticism. There needs to be international condemnation of Iran for what it is doing to Israel right now. Again, rest assured, Israel has the wherewithal to fight, will defend itself, and will beat its aggressors.
Just to bring the latest headlines to our audience here on Bloomberg TV and radio, Jordan is now saying that it has temporarily closed its airspace, and Iraq, according to Samaria TV, has closed its airspace as well, as we continue to see this attack ongoing. Congressman, you of course sit on the Appropriations Committee. You and your colleagues are not currently in Washington, not planning to return until November. Do you think there could be a need for a special session to return to Washington to address potential supplemental funding that could be needed for Israel, or for that matter to address the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, which has affected your district?
It's an excellent question. Let me address the latter first. On Hurricane Helene, which did impact not only the great state of Tennessee, but our friends and neighbors, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. In the continuing resolution, which I voted for, I always vote to keep the government open. This is why we need to keep the government open. I can't stress that enough. But we allowed a drawdown of about $20 billion worth of funds for FEMA. So they've got a pool of money that is available to them immediately. In addition, in that same CR, we've allowed some non-disaster funds to be able to be used by FEMA. So I think they should be okay. They will react to this and have. Fortunately, our state has been declared a disaster area, so FEMA funds will be available. In regard to the Middle East and to defense, one of the reasons we need to get a budget passed, and I sit on the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. As you know, I chair the Energy and Water Subcommittee, but I sit on defense appropriations. This is why we need to get a robust defense budget passed so that our troops have the munitions to do their job, have the resources to do their job, whether it's the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, Space Force. It is critically important that we fund the government. I'd like to see that done by December 20th, but the reality is we may have to come back. I'm willing to come back and do whatever's necessary, but on the disaster side, there should be more than enough resources available based on the terms of the continuing resolution that we just passed into law.
As we spend time with Congressman Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee, new headlines crossing the terminal now. Israel says it has closed its airspace following an attack by Iran. Jordan also temporarily closing its airspace as we keep an eye on the nighttime skyline in Jerusalem right now. Congressman, does that go for military funding as well? Because there were a lot of defense hawks in the House who had an allergy to this idea of an extended CR. It could have brought us into March, for instance, which would have essentially resulted in a pay cut for the Pentagon here. Kayleigh's asking about the potential for a special session. Can that wait till the lame duck? When do you handle all this?
An excellent question. I consider myself a defense hawk and a budget hawk. I want to see our discretionary dollars on that appropriators put out, whether it's on defense or any of the 12 subcommittees, including mine on energy and water, money spent well and money spent wisely. We've got some major decisions to make before December 20th. Yeah. First and foremost, what would be the top end number? The House is a lower number, and I respect that, to the FRA. The Senate is $100 billion over that. So that's a big stumbling point. Yeah. The reality is we need to address this. I think there's sufficient
Congressman, I wish we had more time. Come back and talk to us when we get some solutions here on funding. Chuck Fleischmann of Tennessee on Bloomberg.
21 on Wall Street. The blue chip markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Iran fires missiles at Israel. The National Security Council says President Biden is monitoring the Iranian attack against Israel. Now, both Israel and Jordan say their airspace is closed. Bonds and gold climbed, stocks dropped as investors retreat to safer corners of the market after Iran fired missiles at Israel following targeted ground raids initiated in Lebanon. Right to the numbers now with the S&P down 73, down 1.3%. The Dow down 290, a decline of 0.7%. And we've got NASDAQ, the composite index, dropping 2.1% right now, down 384 points. 10-year at 3.71%, with a 2-year that's yielding 3.59%. Gold is advancing 1.2%. 26.67 the ounce on the precious metal. And again, keeping an eye on West Texas Intermediate crude up 4.9%, 71.48 a barrel, and crude oil up now by 4.7%. Talking Brent here, the global benchmark above $75, 75.01. So again, recapping, U.S. stocks selling off, S&P down now by 1.3%. Stay with Bloomberg for the very latest on developments out of the Middle East, and for on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash. Balance of Power continues now. Once again, your hosts, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. I'm Kaylee Lyons alongside Joe Matthew. We are in New York today here on Bloomberg TV and radio for the vice presidential debate between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz that is set to begin less than 8 hours from now. But of course, the headlines today focused instead on what's happening in the Middle East as Iran has sent 100 missiles toward Israel in a direct attack, what they're calling a first wave of an attack. We're hearing from the National Security Council through a spokesperson that President Biden and Vice President Harris are monitoring the attack against Israel from the Situation Room and receiving regular updates from their national security team. President Biden, according to the NSC, has directed the U.S. military to aid Israel's defense against Iranian attacks and shoot down missiles targeting Israel, Joe.
Shades of April, Kaylee. We talked about this, of course, when that happened, and the U.S. and other allies were very quick to help defend Israel. We could be witnessing that again as we speak here, with missiles in the air and Israel announcing that its airspace has been closed following this news of the Iran attack. Jordan temporarily closing its airspace. Iraq has closed its airspace, according to Samaria TV. Many people are in bomb shelters right now in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, across the country, and we're glad to be joined by Ethan Bronner, Bloomberg's Israel bureau chief, joining us live from Tel Aviv. Ethan, it's great to have you. We thank you for being with us here, of course, at a precarious moment. And there's reporting as well that not only have these missiles been launched by Iran, but there was, in fact, a shooting attack in Tel Aviv, with police now reporting 4 civilians killed. Can you give us a sense of what's happening on the ground there?
Well, I mean, I'm in my safe room, as it's called, so I can't give you too much on the ground news. I can say that it is not far from here, a couple of miles from here in Jaffa, where the shooting occurred. I believe they're saying there are 8 dead people now, actually. And meanwhile, we've had about 100 or 150 ballistic missiles from Iran come at us. The entire country's been told to go into safe rooms or bomb shelters. This room that I'm in is fairly typical. It's in a new apartment that we're renting, and this particular room has got steel all around it and steel on its windows and doors to prevent a missile from damaging you. So that's what's going on. Obviously, this is all in the wake of Israel's attacks in Lebanon.
Well, that's right. A limited ground incursion underway in just the last 24 hours. Ethan, of course, as we think about when we have seen scenes like this before, it was just about 6 months ago that Iran sent 300 missiles and drones toward Israel. Largely, those were intercepted. Is there any sense whether any of these missiles have successfully reached their targets at this point?
We don't have any clarity that there are no known injuries that I'm aware of from the missile. I believe that some did get through, or parts of them got through. North Tel Aviv, near the university, it is said that something fell and ambulances were on their way there. We've just heard now another round of red alerts telling us to get back into our shelters if we were not there now. I'm unaware of what clear hits there have been, but it's certain that some would get through. As you say, in April, there were 300 projectiles sent, and I think about 7 or 8 did get through and did cause some damage. And one child was killed, actually.
We just got word from the press pool at the White House that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are in the Situation Room monitoring the Iranian attack, receiving regular updates from their national security team. If we're talking about a first wave here, Ethan, that would imply potentially a second or third, knowing there were hundreds of projectiles launched in the April attack. Is Israel planning for a long night here? What happens in the next couple of hours? You're hearing alerts from inside your safe room as we speak.
That's right. There is due to be another statement by Rear Admiral Hagari, who is the chief military spokesman. He got on TV an hour or two ago to explain that when you hear an alarm, you need to go into your safe room and not get out until you're told. It used to be after 10 minutes you could come out, but they're expecting a couple or several waves of these ballistic missiles. So yes, I think it's going to be a few hours of this anyway. It's hard to know what we're headed for. It's a Jewish holiday beginning tomorrow evening, and actually it's sort of largely a day off tomorrow. The rest of the week is kind of holiday, but for now they have closed all the beaches in central Israel and told people to stay near shelters. So look, it's very hard for me to know where we're headed, but it's clear that there is a fair amount of activity headed this way.
Well, and Ethan, as you remind us, not only is it a holiday week, we are also less than a week out from the 1-year mark since the October 7th attack. Was Israel in a higher state of alert already with what's going on with Lebanon, with the still threat lingering of retaliation from Iran, knowing that that sober anniversary was coming up?
So I think that Israel was in a higher state of alert. I'm not sure it had specifically to do with the anniversary. It had to do with the fact that they had, in the last 2 to 3 weeks, taken an enormous amount of military action in Lebanon, of course, starting with those exploding pagers and walkie-talkies, and then they took out a couple of thousand launcher sites, and of course killed the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. So it's clear that there is a mini war underway, and of course Hezbollah is an allied proxy militia of Iran, and that it would have been shocking for Iran to do nothing. And once they got word that Iran was about to launch, then they started to shift the home instructions, and that's when this began.
All right, Ethan Bronner, our Israel bureau chief, thank you so much, live from Tel Aviv here on Bloomberg TV and radio. We hope you and your family stay safe as these attacks are ongoing. We thank you very much for
appreciate it.
Your reporting. I would point out as well, we've heard from, on X, the platform, the Iran mission to the UN, saying that Iran's legal, rational, and legitimate response to the terrorist acts of the Zionist regime have been duly carried out, going on to say, should the Zionist regime dare to respond or commit further acts of malevolence, a subsequent and crushing response will ensue. And that brings us, of course, Joe, to not just the next stage, the next wave potentially of Iran attacking Israel, but what Israel could potentially do and respond, and just how escalatory this entire situation could grow.
Yeah, we should not assume that this would be the end of this tit for tat, which has, of course, been going on with Hezbollah in Lebanon for months now. Kaylee, we're seeing live images of the Iron Dome at work. This apparently did not take as long for these missiles to arrive as what we saw in April, and there are some questions about whether we're seeing the use of hypersonic missiles, what actual type of technology. It's going to take us some time to pin that down. But the fact of the matter is, This is happening at night in Israel. It's the middle of the day here. People who are going to be watching this vice presidential debate tonight are seeing this happen unfold live in front of their eyes while they're at home, while they're at work.
Absolutely.
And it's informing voters in the questions that they're going to want to hear answered tonight.
Yeah, I do just want to briefly mention we've just heard from the IDF spokesperson, Hagari, saying there are no further threats in the aerial space at this stage. The Israel Homefront Command is now saying residents may exit shelters. So that's the latest on where we are right now. We'll, of course, continue to keep you updated here on Bloomberg TV and radio. But, Joe, you're absolutely right. This is all coming on an incredibly important day in the presidential race when we're going to see J.D. Vance and Tim Walz share a stage here in New York to debate the issues, including, of course, foreign policy and how the U.S. should be approaching the Middle East and the question of Israel. They're likely to face some difficult questions around this tonight. And so we want to go to the spin room floor here in New York now, where Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall is there as preparations are underway for the big event, which kicks off just about 7.5 hours from now. This evening, Tyler, the Middle East probably going to be more forefront on the agenda of questions and topics the candidates will have to address than it would have been prior to today.
Exactly. And, you know, we've already seen former President Trump put out a statement kind of pushing forward this idea that if he was president, maybe this wouldn't have happened. So it will be interesting to see how the two candidates kind of thread that needle tonight, right? We expect Senator J.D. Vance to kind of toe that line, support Trump on that. And then, of course, we know that Vice President Kamala Harris is now in the Situation Room watching this closely, and what Governor Tim Walz can tell us from the Democratic base's point of view when it comes to handling this issue. There's no doubt that foreign policy now is going to take center stage here tonight.
That's for sure. You're in the spin room there, of course, Tyler. We're going to be hearing from surrogates from both candidates this evening.
Yep, definitely. The spin room is already starting to fill up with journalists. We haven't really seen any surrogates quite yet, because this is, you know, the first and likely the only debate between these vice presidential candidates. It's also likely the last debate of this presidential cycle, which is just raising these stakes even higher, because as you both know, we are exactly 5 weeks away from Election Day. So we are expecting the surrogates to come out as both of the campaigns kind of have this last push to appeal to voters. And we are talking about foreign policy. We are also expecting domestic policy to take center stage tonight. As you both know, both of these running mates were chosen in part due to their Midwest roots and how they can kind of appeal to some of the more industrial Midwestern voters in some key battleground states that our Bloomberg News Morning Console poll has been following for a sense of the messaging that we might expect. We actually pulled this bite from Senator J.D. Vance at the Republican National Convention earlier this summer.
It's about all of us, and it's about who we're fighting for. It's about the auto worker in Michigan wondering why out-of-touch politicians are destroying their jobs. It's about the factory worker in Wisconsin who makes things with their hands and is proud of American craftsmanship.
Now you heard him mention Michigan and Wisconsin there. Those are 2 of the 7 key battleground states that we watch in our Bloomberg News Morning Console poll. I'd point you to the most recent iteration out last week, which shows Vice President Kamala Harris leading former President Trump among likely voters in those 7 key battleground states by about 3 percentage points. So a very, very close race here. Now, we play J.D. Vance. I'll say for Walz's part, he's often billed as somebody with this, quote, Midwest sensibility. That's a line that the Harris campaign often uses. So we'll be watching closely tonight to see how both of these candidates appeal to these voters in some key battleground states, including perhaps pushing some more protectionist or populist viewpoints.
All right, Tyler Kendall reporting for Bloomberg from the spin room at the site of tonight's vice presidential debate. Tyler, thank you so much. We'll keep tabs with Tyler as we make our way closer to special coverage that starts at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. The debate begins at 9, and we'll have the full simulcast for you here on Bloomberg TV and radio. Not too far from where Kaylee and I are right now, the CBS Broadcast Center on West 57th Street will become the center of the political universe a short time from now. Kaylee, it's time to assemble our panel. We haven't gotten to Rick and Jeannie on such a busy day until right now. Of course, Bloomberg Politics contributors, Jeannie Shanzano, political science professor at Iona University, and Rick Davis, partner at Stone Court Capital. Jeannie, this is a test, of course, for the Biden administration, and Kamala Harris is part of it. She is in the Situation Room right now with Joe Biden, and I wonder the way you're kind of looking at this as a political opportunity or liability for a member of this administration, it's also a chance for her to appear presidential today, right?
It is, and you just took the words right out of my mouth, Joe. I was going to say test. It's a test for Kamala Harris. It's also a test for J.D. Vance and a test for Tim Walz. Of all the things I'm sure that Tyler was just talking about that they've prepared for tonight, I am not sure that they spent as much time, say, on foreign policy as they would have on the economy, immigration, and some of those other issues. So this is going to be a test for them. And I would just say, we already know where Donald Trump is on this. He has issued a statement on Truth Social saying that the Harris-Biden campaign and administration are leading us to World War III and have left us less safe. And of course, you've got the president saying what we expect to hear from Tim Walz and Kamala Harris when she does talk, that Israel has every right to defend itself vigorously and the U.S. will do everything it can to protect Israel. So those are sort of, I think, what we might hear tonight. What I hope we would hear is a little bit more policy specifics on the Middle East, but we'll have to see if we get there tonight.
Yeah, and of course, as we consider the policy specifics and what Americans are looking to hear from these candidates, there is a question, Rick, to what extent they want insight on foreign policy, or they're thinking about kitchen table issues like the economy or the border, for example. Does news like this, the attention it's getting in the media, the grabbing of the headlines, actually impact voter sentiment, make them more likely to want to hear what the commander-in-chief or potential second-in-command, I guess you could say, to the commander-in-chief would want to say on these issues?
Yeah, news travels very quickly through these cycles. And even though yesterday we spent virtually the entire day talking about the impact that the Hurricane Helene was going to have on states like North Carolina and Georgia, today the entire media coverage seems to be laser focused on the attacks from Iran onto Israel. And so yeah, voters, they're like us, right? They're consumers. And so they're looking at this saying, I want to know more about what's going on here. What's interesting about this is Kamala Harris comes in most recent polls doing very well as commander-in-chief. In fact, a few I've seen recently, public polls, they have indicated that she has a slight advantage over Donald Trump, a former commander-in-chief. And so this is a very high wire act for the current administration. They got to get this right. And I think the ground that they are on now, which is safe, is we're defending Israel at all costs. And I think that could be an advantage for her. And it just depends tonight on how her vice presidential nominee, Tim Walz, handles it.
A couple of important headlines from the IDF. First, a spokesman saying there are no known injuries from the Iran missile launches, which is pretty remarkable considering we're talking about more than 100 of them. Also, from the Israeli military, this attack was serious and will have consequences. Jeannie implying that this test will not just be done today.
That's right. I mean, I think what we are all bracing for is a retaliation by Israel. We know, of course, this was an retaliation by Iran. We expect Israel to hit back. We remember after April, they were more contained in the way they responded. And we have to wait and see what they're going to do. But this is going to be a big concern for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris sitting there in the Situation Room, I'm sure, in direct contact with the IDF and the leaders of Israel to try to see if they could do anything to de-escalate this situation at this point. That's been their watchword as it pertains to the Middle East of late, but very hard to see how they achieve that. And so that leaves them in a very difficult situation vis-a-vis their Middle Eastern policy.
All right, Jeannie Shanzano and Rick Davis, our signature political panel, Bloomberg Politics contributors, thank you for joining us this hour. And of course, we'll have much more with Rick and Jeannie in the later edition of Balance of Power at 5 p.m. and in our special coverage of the VP debate, which will be simulcast on Bloomberg. That special coverage beginning at 8 p.m. Eastern time here on Bloomberg TV and radio. In the meantime, though, before Vance and Walz share a stage, we are keeping focus on the Middle East and the impact this is having on the markets, as you are seeing some movement, especially in oil. So let's get a check on the latest with Charlie Pellet here in New York.
Thanks very much, Kayla Lyons. We begin with crude oil surging now by 3.3%, $70.44 for a barrel of oil traded here in New York. WTI Brent, the global benchmark, up by almost 3.5%, $74.13 a barrel. Recapping, resetting, bringing you up to date on what is happening. Iran now retaliating against Israel with missile strikes. Iran said it fired dozens of missiles into Israel Israel. It represents a sharp escalation of the months-long conflict between Israel and the Iran-backed militias of Hezbollah and Hamas. A spokesperson for the Israel Defense Force says there are no known injuries from Iran. The IDF says many missiles were intercepted. There were some strikes. Orders to shelter in place were sent to Israelis' mobile phones and announced on national television. S&P down 1.2%, down 69 points, again close to session lows. The Dow down 0.6%, down 262 points. Nasdaq down by 2%. 10-year 3.72% with the 2-year 3.60%. Gold is advancing 1%. Spot gold 26.62 the ounce, and West Texas Intermediate crude again up 3.5%, 70.54 a barrel. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. Our coverage will continue. Balance of Power continues now. Back we go to your hosts once again, Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. The market's awfully important here as we talk politics and more specifically geopolitics today on Balance of Power, with more than 100 missiles launched by Iran toward Israel. And good news, just in the last couple of minutes, the Israeli government, in fact, an IDF spokesman, a military spokesperson, making clear there are no known injuries from Iran launches. But of course, Kaylee, we also know that there will be a response by Israel once the dust settles on this. And that's where we start our conversation with Congressman Jake Auchincloss, the Democrat from Massachusetts, of course, a Marine combat veteran, joins us now with his take on what's happening right now. Congressman, it's really good to have you back here at this moment on Bloomberg TV and radio. What should the response be from Israel?
Thanks for having me on. I'm not going to speak to Israel's response. It'll be up to the IDF and leadership about the time, place, and manner of the reprisal. But clearly, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps cannot sit in Tehran, 1,000 miles away from Israel, and launch a genocidal campaign against the Jewish state without any consequences. There needs to be personally felt consequences for this kind of action. That's the immediate imperative. But in the long run, the United States needs to architect a new strategy towards Iran, because ever since 2003, when George W. Bush kicked down the door in Iraq and left a vacuum of power that Iran filled, there has not been a coherent strategy against the Islamic Republic, and it has helped fuel this escalation in the Middle East. And we have our objectives around what the strategy should be. I think we need to wedge Iran from China. I think we got to uplift its moderate middle class. We got to marginalize its hardliners. But we need bipartisan consensus, not finger pointing, but consensus about how we go forward.
Well, Congressman, as you say, Iran does need to face consequences for this action. Could those consequences not have consequences by extension, specifically, say, for the U.S. military presence in the Middle East? As we know, thousands more troops have been sent there as the tension has been rising.
America will need to forward deploy to ensure that we can protect our troops as well as our ally Israel in the region. And in the long term, we need to continue the defense and intelligence cooperation that has allowed aerial defense systems like Iron Dome to provide a very important shield for Israeli civilians. That shield is not just about protecting human life, by the way, of course, that's its primary aim. It is also a de-escalatory mechanism, because it affords Israel the latitude to de-escalate after incredible escalatory actions like what we just saw, where 100 ballistic missiles were fired at its population centers.
Congressman, we spoke a short time ago with your colleague from Tennessee, Chuck Fleischman, who said that the Biden administration deserves some of the blame for this happening, because he claims that the administration has not been hard enough on Iran and has not forcefully defended Israel enough. This is a similar refrain that we're hearing from the Trump campaign. How do you respond?
It's false. Joe Biden is one of the strongest pro-Israel presidents in American history, and he's been walking a tightrope in the Middle East, where there are no good choices that come to the resolute desk in the Oval Office. He is rejecting calls from the hard left that would have had the United States handcuff Israel and prevent the return of any hostages and platform Hamas for post-war governance in Gaza. But he's also rejected calls from the hard right that are seeking to directly escalate and enmesh U.S. troops in Middle Eastern warfare. We spent 2 decades doing conflict in the Middle East. I don't think Americans want to have U.S. troops in combat in the Middle East anymore. We have to orient towards the pacing strategic priority, which is China in the Indo-Pacific. And that means we need Israel and the Abraham Accords to basically be a hedge and a stability mechanism for the Middle East.
Well, sir, as we consider the question around Israel here, and specifically its relationship with the U.S., knowing that all of this activity we've seen in recent weeks has come as the Biden administration has been pushing for restraint, for a ceasefire deal, not just with Hamas, but also one that was on the table for a ceasefire with Hezbollah. Instead, what we've gotten is the taking out of the leader of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and a ground incursion into Lebanon. What do you make of the administration's dealings with and attempts to influence Israel, which don't seem to have been, frankly, effective at all?
Well, we've heard from the administration that they support Israel's limited ground operation in southern Lebanon to displace Hezbollah missile launchers that have made it impossible for 70,000 Israelis to repopulate northern Israel territory, and that we support eliminating Nasrallah, who is a terrorist who has Lebanese blood on his hands, Syrian blood, American blood, Israeli blood. The world is safer without him. Now, there are obvious frustrations between the president and the prime minister about strategy in Gaza, particularly Netanyahu's unwillingness to help architect governance that is an alternative to Hamas, Palestinian-led, Arab-backed, Western-supported. But that tension in no way undermines the fundamental alliance between these two democratic nations.
We have been surging troops and material into the region. As you well know, Congressman, a few thousand more troops were sent to the Middle East just this week in anticipation of this moment. Where's the line on the U.S. defending Israel if this continues to escalate?
Well, the United States, we're not going to telegraph our lines about where we stand with our allies or protecting our own troops. The nations that mean to do harm to us and to our allies need to know that wherever they might be, the United States is going to protect our troops and our interests and our allies, and that includes, of course, Israel and our troops stationed in Iraq. I think that message has been received in capitals across the region, and it was demonstrated in April. It was demonstrated again today with really an impressive example of U.S. and Israeli technology and cooperation helping to shoot down 100 ballistic missiles. But we need to maintain this deterrent going forward, but we also have to pair it, as I said, with congressionally led consensus on a new Iran strategy. Because for 20 years now, we've been pointing fingers at each other. We've been saying, you did this and he did that. And it is not working against Iran. We need to have a first principles, bipartisan, congressionally anchored approach to Iran that wedges it from China and that marginalizes its hardliners.
Congressman, it is not lost on any of us that all of this is happening in the Middle East on the day that we are set to see Governor Tim Walz and Senator J.D. Vance share a debate stage to talk about policy, including foreign policy, with the reminder that we saw during the primary campaign when Joe Biden was still leading the Democratic ticket. In states like Michigan, there was a sizable portion of the vote that chose not to vote for him over protest of the ongoing war in Gaza. In Michigan, for example, there were more than 100,000 uncommitted votes. How difficult is it going to be for the new Democratic ticket of Tim Walz and Kamala Harris to navigate this issue if it's back in the headlines in this way as we get closer to Election Day just 5 weeks from today?
The uncommitted vote for Joe Biden in Michigan was similar to the uncommitted vote for Barack Obama in his re-election campaign in Michigan. So I don't think that is a strong signal of discontent within the Democratic base with Joe Biden or with Kamala Harris. The simple reality is that foreign policy is not going to be a decisive voting issue for swing voters. What we have seen is that the state of the economy is overwhelmingly a top issue. Immigration is an important issue. Reproductive rights are an important issue. But even amongst the demographic cohort that researchers often point to as the one most animated by Gaza, which is young voters, even then it's barely a top 10 issue. So I think the important thing is for our current commander-in-chief and for our next commander-in-chief to continue to conduct U.S. strategy in the best interests of the United States and our allies and for free nations throughout the world and not worry about polls.
All right, Congressman, great to have you today as all of this has been developing. That's Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts. We appreciate you being here, sir, on Bloomberg TV and radio. Now, just to reiterate the latest we have gotten from Israel, according to the IDF, there are no known injuries from Iran's launches. Many of the missiles were intercepted, though there were some strikes, and the IDF promising there will be consequences to Iran launches, as the airspace has now reopened in Israel and flights are set to resume within the hour. We want to get more, though, on the political implications of this happening and how it factors into the presidential race, as we were just discussing with the congressman, and turn to Jen Jackson, who is assistant professor of political science at Syracuse University. They're also author of Black Woman Taught Us, an Intimate History of Black Feminism. Jen, welcome back to the program. I wonder if you heard what the congressman said there, if you agree with it, that this whole notion of the Middle East and upset with this administration's policy over Israel is not going to be as much of an issue now than it was during the primary campaign. Do you believe this brings it back to the forefront?
You know, I think this is really important. I think the congressman has some valid points in that, you know, for young people who recently we pulled through the Gen Forward survey, Gaza has not pinged in the top 4 or 5 issues that they're concerned about right now. And it's been surprising because that has been kind of the overwhelming topic that has concerned media. But when we talk to young people, what they're saying they're concerned about is the economy. They're concerned about healthcare. They're concerned about the Dobbs decision. So I do think that to some degree, the congressman's points are valid. But for a very vocal minority of young people, this will be a big issue. And it will be people who are organizers, people who are tapped in on college campuses, and young people who have large social media followings who can also mobilize other young voters, maybe not to vote for Kamala and VP as our next president. So I think that there's a risk here to think that the polls are not actually giving some guidance, but they are actually helping us understand the complexity of what people are thinking about this election.
That's really interesting, Jen. More broadly, are young people tuning in to watch this thing tonight at 9 p.m. like the old folks with their appointment viewing, like my wife and I might consider doing, or are they watching this caught up on social media tomorrow?
You know, surprisingly, they are tuning in. I was surprised even in my class yesterday. I teach gender and politics at Syracuse University, and my young people who also told me that they're now big fans of Billy Joel and Sting, which surprised me. But they are also going to watch parties tonight. The watch parties on our campus have been really popular. Kids are coming out, eating pizza, and talking about politics. So they are absolutely tuning in. And the last debate between VP Harris and former President Donald Trump had major views, and it wasn't on social media, it was live. So I do think that we should consider that this is a very popular kind of consumption moment in terms of television media. We have folks like Taylor Swift coming out and getting folks more tuned in to the election. And someone named Chapel Roan, who I didn't know about until my students told me about this week, is talking about her feelings in politics. And a lot of young people are saying that matters to them. So they're paying attention.
Jen, we just have about a minute left, but could I just ask you, given that it does seem to be still the Harris-Walz campaign that has the momentum on its side, does that also mean there is greatest downside risk for Governor Walz tonight?
You know, I think that the momentum is happening for a specific group of people. I still think that young conservative folks are not swayed by anything that they've seen. So I think that tonight, what Governor Walz can do for us is help us understand how he contributes to this conversation. I think we've got a good picture of what J.D. Vance is bringing, which is a lot of the same things, a lot of the same kind of repeating points from Project 2025, the same stuff we've seen from Donald Trump for the past few years. But people don't actually know what Walz can bring to us. So I think he has an opportunity here to tell us what his actual approach is and what he brings to the VP Harris agenda that we've already been familiar with.
Jen, it's great to have you back. Jen Jackson, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University. Of course, the debate starts 9 p.m. Eastern time, but Kaylee will start our special coverage at 8 p.m. Eastern. And what a reminder today. There's only so much you can prepare for with this story coming out of Israel as we speak.
Yep, of course, Iran having sent 100 missiles toward Israel, the IDF saying largely those were intercepted, though some did strike, but the IDF also saying there are no additional threats that have been identified at this time. We'll, of course, continue to have the latest for you here on Bloomberg TV and radio, not just on Balance of Power, but on Bloomberg Business Week. That is straight ahead, Joe.
Carol and Tim on the way, live from New York. We'll meet you at 5 p.m. Eastern for the late edition of Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Make sure to subscribe to the Balance of Power podcast, too. Spotify, Apple, you figure that out. We'll be there.
Watch us live weekdays on YouTube. You can listen anytime at the website, Bloomberg.com.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
A very good afternoon, everyone. On this first day of the fourth quarter, October 1st, 2024, I'm Carol Masser along with Tim Stenivek live here on Bloomberg Business Week on radio, TV, YouTube, Bloomberg Originals. Once again, the war in the Middle East leading to risk aversion among investors. We did see bonds rally. We saw stocks dropping, although I should point out that stocks are definitely off their lows. So we've seen a little bit of a pullback from that initial reaction. The VIX, though, did spike higher, hitting a key level that usually indicates more volatility ahead. But we're going to talk a little bit about the markets in just a moment.
Yeah, oil prices surging. Brent briefly rose above $75 a barrel. We're going to have more on the trade, as Carol mentioned, in just a moment. Certainly risk front and center for us as Iran retaliates against Israel, launching an attack on Israel using ballistic missiles. Israel out saying that many missiles have been intercepted and no known injuries. Carol, the strike is the second direct attack by Tehran on Israel so far.
We have more ahead, and as you would expect, that is our focal point on this Tuesday. Also, closer to home, the first dock worker strike on the U.S. East Coast in nearly 50 years. We're going to get into that. And then all of this, the Middle East, what's happening here on the East Coast, likely to come at tonight's vice presidential debate. So, and more, safe to say. So we're going to have a preview of that as well.
All that and more on Bloomberg Business Week over the next hour. First up, though, a check on today's trade and top business stories. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, Tim and Carol. Here's what's going on. Stocks selling off. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all in the red. We are off session lows. 10-year 3.73% as we recap and reset. The Israeli military says Iran fired more than 100 ballistic missiles directly at the country. An escalation in the battle between the Middle Eastern rivals, fought mainly so far through proxies. A spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces says many of the missiles were intercepted, but there were several hits in the south and central parts of the country. An IDF spokesman says there will be consequences to the Iran missile launches. S&P down 45, down 0.8%. The Dow down 104, down 0.2%. The NASDAQ Composite Index now down 254 points, a decline of 1.4%. 10-year yield 3.73% with a 2-year that's currently yielding 3.61%. Spot gold up $28 the ounce, up 1.1%, 26.63 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude had been up 5%, now higher by 3.1%, 70.29 a barrel. And Brent, the global benchmark, up by 3.1%, 73.88 a barrel. So again, recapping, stocks lower across the board. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ, all very much in the red. S&P right now down by 0.8%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Charlie, of course, mentioning the concerns in the Middle East, what seems to be an escalation, although I do feel like the conversations, concerns, many would feel like the conversations and concerns over Middle East escalation are a bit of a thing of the past. We are awaiting, of course, an update from the White House, and as soon as that happens, we will take you there live. In the meantime, we want to get more on the situation in the Middle East. With us is Bloomberg News reporter Dan Williams. He is with us from Israel, along with retired Major General Mastin Robison. He is geopolitical intelligence advisor at the veteran-owned and operated investment bank Academy Securities Advisory Board. General Robison is in Greenville, South Carolina. Dan, we do want to start with you. Tell us the latest. Tell us what you've seen. Give us an update.
Well, extraordinary developments over the last hour or so. A major salvo of missiles from Iran set off sirens pretty much throughout Israel. And keep in mind that Israel's been on a war footing for almost a year since the October 7th attack by Hamas from Gaza that triggered the war there, a war that quickly spilled into a multi-front conflict, and now is shaping up to be a direct war between Israel and Iran. So I heard something like 25 explosions of interceptions around Jerusalem. There are similar events in and around Tel Aviv. Right now, it's not quite clear if there are casualties. There is some damage from missile strikes or from the strikes of debris from missile interceptions. This all came in conjunction with what appears to have been a Palestinian gun attack, a mass shooting by 2 gunmen in Jaffa that killed 4 people and wounded at least 3 others. So an extraordinary turn of events, given that had we been speaking just an hour or 2 ago, we'd be discussing Israel's larger scale incursions into Lebanese territory that began just about 20 hours ago, and pretty much turned that into a new ground campaign for the Israelis.
Dan, certainly glad to see that you're safe and hear from you right now. There's not a lot of historical precedent for this, but in this year, there actually is. It's the second direct attack by Tehran on Israel so far this year. Just from what you understand about this attack versus what we saw back in April, compare the two. How is this one similar? How is this one different?
Well, back in April, Iran fired around 300 projectiles in total. Around a third of them were ballistic missiles. The other 2/3 were drones or cruise missiles. Those have smaller payloads, very small payloads in the case of drones. I'm referring to the amount of explosives they carry. They also fly quite slowly. A drone can take 9 hours to reach Israel from Iran. A cruise missile could take 2 hours. When it comes to ballistic missiles, the flight time is something like 10 or 12 minutes. and the payload can be as much as half a ton of high explosive. What appears to have happened now is the Iranians fired only ballistic missiles. I'm hearing something in the order of 181. That's the latest figure we're hearing from the Israeli side. That is not to be, that hasn't been confirmed yet. But clearly there is an attempt here to overwhelm the Israeli defense systems. Israel has very good air defenses, but they're very expensive. Presumably they can be stretched with enough of a volley when fired against them. And definitely this was an extended case of sirens and interceptions. The whole event lasted something like half an hour, 40 minutes. So certainly dramatic, certainly jarring for many Israelis. Israel is now talking about inevitable retaliation, though the official line is that it will decide when and how, so it may not be immediate. But certainly this is a dramatic development, any way you look at it.
General Robinson, I want to bring you into it. If you are an ally of Iran, if you're an ally of Israel, how are you thinking about what happens next? How are you militarily either supporting or preparing to support what's next?
Yeah, great question. I think if I'm a supporter of Iran, I'm saying we knew they had to do something to save face. Given the failure in April, and that was actually, I agree with what Dan said, but I think the earlier one was more complex and it took more systems to knock them out. But we had more assets over there this time. We'd pushed 15Es and F-16s and 2 carrier battle groups, and so there's a fair amount of support over there right now from an Israeli standpoint to help be defensive of Iran's attack. You've got to believe that Iran had low confidence that they were going to be that successful, given we've made no secret to the amount of reinforcement we sent over, and they certainly were hugely unsuccessful on the first go-round back in April. So I'm not sure that this is viewed much more than, okay, this is the status quo. We knew it was going to happen. We knew Iran had to do something. Will Israel immediately respond? Probably not. Will they take their time? Probably. Want to have the best effect they can without ramping it up. But I still think Israel is really more concerned with Hezbollah and what's going on there than with Iran and what's going on with the attacks from Iran.
Well, General, does this attack from Iran, in your view, get Israel closer to the end of this war that has gone on at this point for close to a year?
No, because I see the war has never been with Iran. It's been with proxies. Iran is fighting this thing through its proxies and was pretty effective up until the last week. But the devastation that Israel had on Iran's primary proxy, Hezbollah, that was built expressly to be able to attack Israel if Israel ever launched against the Iranian nuclear capabilities. It has completely been dismantled from a command and control architecture standpoint. I mean, there's still 180,000 warriors out there that could be a real pain in the neck for Israel. But what they demonstrated this past week of the ability to be so precise, such precision, know exactly when and where and how people were, is really just, I mean, it's amazing the way they pulled that off. That can't be lost on Iran that, wow, if Hezbollah was that infiltrated, are we more infiltrated than we think? So I think Israel, based on what's happened the last week, has a huge uptick in its psychological advantage in this conflict right now, because they've really got Hezbollah on their heels.
Yeah.
It's just a function of what they do next.
Dan, what is, gosh, not a great word, victory for Israel in all of this? Because it's interesting that here we are almost a year in from Hamas, the attack on Israel, and I almost feel like we don't really talk about the hostages much anymore, which I thought was originally the end game to get everybody back home. So having said that, what is the win or victory for Israel in this? Ultimately.
Well, Israel's laid out some Israel has laid out three very simple war goals. One of them, as you alluded to, is the recovery of all hostages from Gaza. It's hard to know what's going on. We know that none have been recovered recently. We don't know to what extent Israeli forces, intelligence services on the ground are working on locating them, maybe planning rescues, maybe paying ransoms, maybe paying prizes for individual actors who might be able to deliver them on a private basis. We don't know this, but clearly there have been no public developments there. A second war goal is to defeat Hamas and basically remove the threat posed from Gaza to Israel. That appears to be well on its way. It's significant that even though Israel has been pummeling Hezbollah, as the general described in recent weeks, there's been very little in the way of Hamas supporting fire from Gaza. It appears because Hamas simply lacks the rockets or the capability. It would appear Israel is on the way to achieving that. The third goal is the return of some 60,000 Israelis from the north of the country who were displaced by by Hezbollah fire from October 8th. The safe return of those people home. Now that is trickier, and it appears that the Israelis are ramping up efforts to achieve that goal, specifically by decapitating the Hezbollah leadership, degrading the weaponry, and as of last night, moving in physically a fairly large number of ground troops to physically dislodge what remains of Hezbollah fighters. These are frontline fighters. They're called the Radwan Force, considered elite, from southern Lebanon, from towns and villages facing northern Israel, the sort of place where if Hezbollah had wanted to, they could stage an October 7th-like attack on northern Israel. Indeed, the Israelis say that when Hamas waged that attack, they effectively stole the thunder from Hezbollah. Hezbollah had been publicly talking about such an attack, and now that would appear to be potentially obsolete, but Israel doesn't consider it that way. It intends to go in to capture, kill any Hezbollah members it finds, to uproot their infrastructure in the south, to blow up tunnels, fill them up with cement. And they're saying that could take a number of weeks. But they also seem pretty assured that once that happens, residents of the north would be able to return to their homes, potentially as soon as the end of the year. So it would appear there is now a timeline being firmed up. Obviously, the one big question out of those three goals is how and when and in what condition those around 100 hostages might be recovered from the Gaza Strip.
Dan, you're joining us from Jerusalem. Israel now staging a multi-front war effort. Help us understand, or how would you characterize the support from Israelis for what the government and the IDF are doing?
In general, polls have shown, certainly in the opening days of this war, wall-to-wall support for the war, for the military, and that has eroded at the edges, more or less, when respondents are asked about the functioning of the government, about Prime Minister Netanyahu. He has a very robust opposition that's accusing him of foot-dragging on the hostage issue. There are allegations he may be drawing out the war because of his political problems, his legal problems. He, of course, denies this. I think it would be fair to say that as of last week, in fact, there was one poll on Israel's leading TV news channel, found a significant rise in support for him, given the way he, his government, his security services have pulled off a really remarkable cascade of offensive actions against Hezbollah, including the famous beeper sabotage, the walkie-talkie sabotage, though Israel has yet to formally claim responsibility, the assassinations of high-level Hezbollah leaders, including the Hezbollah leader just on Friday when Netanyahu was giving a speech at the UN General Assembly. It would appear now, again, there is a poll indicating that, again, Israeli support for this war is on the rise. As the general noted, there is a sense that Israel has retaken the initiative here. It's given a psychological buoyancy to many Israelis. Clearly, an event like tonight's missile salvo will have shaken many Israelis. But given that they're facing foes with whom there really is no compromise, Iran and its proxies, including Hamas and Hezbollah, are ideologically committed to seeing Israel destroyed. So it's not as if there is really a diplomatic path for a long-term resolution. There's no such thing as peace talks. At best, there would be ceasefire talks. And I think many Israelis have tired of ceasefires that prove short-lived and potentially give the advantage to their enemies. So I would say that morale remains strong. Obviously, this is totally unprecedented. Israelis are comparing this war only to the 1948 war, when Israel was founded against the odds, against numerically superior and often better armed enemies. So they see this as the long haul, but I think public support does remain strong behind the military and behind seeing this through.
If you're just joining us, just to rehash the headlines, Iran launching an attack on Israel using ballistic missiles. Israel saying that many missiles were intercepted, no known injuries. The strike, the second direct attack by Tehran on Israel this year. We are talking with Bloomberg News reporter Dan Williams. He is in Israel. Also with us, retired Major General Mastin Robison, geopolitical intelligence advisor at Academy Securities Advisory Board. General, I want to bring you back into the conversation. I am curious about the Middle East. We lump it all together. There are many moving parts, different allies, different relationships. The New York Times over the weekend talking a lot about the axis of resistance in the Middle East, the Iranian-backed network of militias in the Middle East known as the axis of resistance, but basically saying that the response that they have done has been minimal or feeble. That was the Times words. I do wonder, what are the conversations that are likely going on across the region, between the United States and across the region, Europe and across the region? What's likely going on right now?
Yeah, I think it's further solidifying what began, over the past 3-4 years, 5 years of the Middle East really being the fear factor that is the -- case for all Middle Eastern countries, with the exception of Syria and Iran, is Iran. Nobody, their worst scenarios that Iran in essence invades. You've got, the difference of Persians and Arabs. You've got the difference of Sunnis and Shias. You've got a long history of, stated objective by Iran and its proxies that the complete destruction of Israel is their objective in life. So I think as the Saudi Arabias and the other Middle Eastern countries have, starting back last year when they, in the spring, when they helped defend Israel, and we haven't heard yet how much they were involved in, this defense of Israel's airspace as well. But I think you've got more than, certainly in my knowledge, memory, of solidification of allies working anti-Iranian than we've ever had, which I think bodes well for the Middle East and for Europe and for the United States, because it's been a bonding effort, anti-Iranian bonding effort. And then as you've seen Iran, Russia, China kind of drawing closer together over the last couple of years, I think all that is positive from a standpoint of, if you're a Western culture or nation, saying we probably have more unanimity in defense of freedom today than we had 5 or 10 years ago.
Wow.
So General, if you were advising the United States right now, what would you say the U.S.'s role should be in the region?
U.S.'s role, is our best role is to be able to create bonds, unanimity, alliances, even if they're only defense alliances. But certainly the Middle East has demonstrated over the last 5-10 years that they desperately want to be more than just a fuel provider for the world. They want to have a legitimate business platform that is technology centric, and so all of these things are emerging at the same time. So the ability to bring the Middle East out into a stronger economic platform, the ability to further isolate Iran and its proxies, and the ability to leverage off of that a European tie into the Middle East that opens up economic opportunity that goes beyond just fuel, gas and oil.
Dan, I want to go back to you. You're there in Israel. I think some of the latest headlines that we've gotten was from the IDF saying no additional threats identified at this time. The Israel Homefront Command saying residents may exit shelters. Conflict in the region, going to a shelter is, unfortunately, it seems like a much more common occurrence and something that's a way of life in the region. Having said that, is there nervousness, concerns that this is just not done from Iran?
Certainly, but again, the baptism by fire of Iranian missile attacks in Israel was already experienced back in April. So the Israelis weathered it. This was another round of that. As you noted, Israelis have shelters within reach, including in their homes, as a result of the 1991 Gulf War, which I imagine the general was involved in. Israel passed a number of ordinances requiring that new dwellings built after that war each come equipped with what they call a fortified room, effectively a bomb shelter in your house that can double as a dwelling space when there's no war going on. So Israelis literally have a bomb shelter to hand. They have emergency accommodation to hand. They occupy on a daily basis as if it's normal, and then when need be, it turns into a wartime function. It assumes that wartime function. Again, I think Israelis would say that this is unpleasant, but given the fact that some minute or two after the all clear was sounded, I was already hearing voices in the street and buses passing and cars, it would seem that Israelis have actually learned how to rebound pretty quickly. And that may be one of the secrets to persevering, proving resilient, and perhaps even prevailing in this conflict. Though, as you noted, what victory looks like may be quite hard to articulate right now. In terms of the unpleasantness of a massive missile salvo, very unpleasant, I'm sure they would say, but Israel's proven to have a very capable air defense system with the assistance of allies like the United States, France, some Arab security partners as well, as we saw back in April. So for the time being, I think they're just ready to knuckle down and keep going.
All right. Well, we so appreciate both of your time today. Dan, stay safe. Bloomberg News reporter Dan Williams in Israel, and retired Major General Mastin Robison, someone we've leaned on a lot in the past year. He's geopolitical intelligence advisor at Academy Securities Advisory Board, joining us from Greenville, South Carolina.
Well, from one risk to another type of risk, and we're talking about shipping here in the United States. And the first dockworkers strike on the U.S. East Coast since 1977. It began early today after an 11th hour boost in the employer's wage offer came up short. Union members hit the picket lines after midnight, container terminals closed, and Carol, auto shipments ground to a halt.
Yeah, absolutely. Gene Soroka knows firsthand about contract negotiations involving dock workers. He dealt with prolonged negotiations and delays and slowdowns in the movement of goods along the West Coast ports that finally resulted in a new contract just about a year ago. Gene is the executive director of Port of Los Angeles and joins us from LA. Gene, good to have you here on what is turning out to be a very, very busy day. First up, I am curious in terms of, I guess I almost want to ask you about the Middle East, because it is one of those big things when we wrapped up the trading year about a year ago, that when we talk about risks to the world, the investment environment, geopolitics came up. Before we get into the East Coast strike, I would love for you to weigh in on what is happening in the Middle East, and if at all you see any impact or concerns about maybe the outlook of your world.
Good afternoon, Carol and Tim, and you're exactly right. There are a lot of geopolitical influences on supply chain decision makers and have been for some time. Looking at the Middle East today, cargo ships are still rerouting around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, avoiding the Red Sea with the Houthi rebels. Suez Canal receipts are down 80 to 90%, and there's no less than 4 ongoing conflicts. This causes great concern for the certainty of the supply chain and how you have to do reroutes and workarounds to keep commerce flowing. But our thoughts and minds and hearts are with the people on the ground, so making sure families are safe.
So layer on top of that then, the strike that we're now seeing on the East Coast ports, obviously not ideal for many, many different reasons. Are you seeing, first of all, increased traffic on the West Coast ports, your port in particular, because of what's happening here on the East Coast?
Yes, Carol, we started to see an uptick in cargo volume at the beginning of the year. People were a little bit concerned not only about a protracted dock workers negotiation, but drought conditions in the Panama Canal, in addition to those security concerns in the Red Sea. Our cargo volume is up 17% year to date, and we've had a very long peak season that began in June and still continues with some steam here now going into October. In fact, our third quarter ending yesterday is our best on record in 116 years.
Do you see that continuing into the fourth quarter, which starts today?
Typically, the month of October is met with the Golden Week holiday in China, formerly called National Day. We've got enough cargo still there at the major ports in China to profile our vessels next week. October will be strong. Then we might see a tapering off a little bit of the cargo volume, and that's seasonal, no more, no less. We're only in day one of this dock workers strike on the East Coast. No impacts on the ground that we see today, but the next 48, 72 hours will be crucial.
How do you expect, Gene, dock workers on the West Coast, in West Coast ports, to stand in solidarity with their counterparts on the East Coast? Will they refuse to unload freight diverted from East Coast ports?
We have not had any ships that are designated for East or Gulf Coast ports make a left-hand turn and come into Los Angeles. And we're watching that very closely because my experience says that that is sacrosanct between these two working unions. One will not take advantage of another's bargaining position and move ships around. What you have seen are cargo owners that try to hedge against occurrences like this and maybe put a little bit more of their allocation towards West Coast ports, including Los Angeles and Long Beach, that otherwise would have gone to the East Coast. And we also saw that last year as our negotiations with the dock workers here with the ILWU went a little bit longer than some experts expected, and we saw some of our discretionary cargo, that which goes to the middle part of the country, move to those eastern ports.
Yeah, I will point out that estimates from the National Association of Manufacturers show that the strike jeopardizes $2.1 billion in trade daily, and the total economic damage could reduce GDP by as much as $5 billion a day. So that's one statistic, I should say, that we are certainly reporting out. Gene, having said that, I think it's fair to say that there are a lot of folks maybe listening who have no idea what a dock worker makes, what a dock worker gets in terms of benefits, what a dock worker is probably fighting for. What can you tell us about that front?
These are well-paid six-figure jobs, but it's a skill set that's shared by few. The training and education that goes into these folks' curricula that to manage these big pieces of industrial equipment to move off all this cargo, very few and far between in the American workforce. These jobs are good for the middle class. In some cases, they're generational. Port cities like ours here in Los Angeles, around the enclaves of San Pedro and Wilmington, are built around these dock workers and families for generations. The economic landscape globally and in our shipping industry has changed dramatically since COVID. The last time that this dock workers group, the ILA, negotiated was back in 2019, before all these changes took place. The union is saying they need to keep up with the growing economic influence of the shipping lines and the profits that they've earned.
Gene, as Carol mentioned, you dealt with prolonged negotiations and delays and slowdowns in the movements of goods along the West Coast ports that finally resulted in a new contract. That was about a year ago. Given that, what would your advice be to your counterparts at East Coast ports who are going through the strike right now?
Yeah, a good question, Tim. Just keep everybody moving forward. There's a lot that's always said during negotiations. You know, blood pressure goes up, folks get a little bit hot under the collar, but keep people at the table, negotiating on these salient points. In this case, it's wage, automation or robotics, and the other work rules that are necessary. If we're apart, nothing gets done. If you're at the table, we can start chipping away at these issues. And the ports are typically seen as the convener. And I know that the White House is working diligently across several agencies to make sure these talks continue with shuttle diplomacy and just keeping chipping away at these issues. But as that natural convener and the good negotiators that they are, these ports can play a pivotal role in getting to a conclusion.
What's the smart conversation, though, around automation? Our Bloomberg technology team, I was listening to them earlier talk about the subject, and you just have the natural progression of technology taking over tasks that we all used to do by hand or that you needed a human to do it. We know that just continues, especially in the past year and a half. We talked so much about generative AI, so many different things that are changing our world that now have been taken over by technology. So what is the smart conversation around that when you've got businesses that are potentially publicly held companies that are thinking about costs and automation perhaps saves on that aspect? What's the responsibility of companies versus, towards their shareholders versus perhaps their workers?
Great question, Carolyn. It's the most polarizing conversation in our industry, but two thoughts. One, our belief here in Los Angeles is that technology is never moving faster than it is today, but we cannot leave the worker behind. And secondly, when it comes to the automation negotiation between private sector interests and unionized labor, there are very few examples. Only 5% of the 360 ports around the world that are observed have some semblance of automation or robotics. 5%. We're a little heavier here in Southern California and honestly have seen mixed results. But there are examples where if we could peel back everything else, automation can create additional capacity at that marine terminal and port. We can also take a workforce and not have to just chop it down by 80%, as we've seen in some cases. If we can keep that workforce stable, double or even go beyond 2x capacity at these marine terminals, there may be a formula here that helps both sides tremendously. Now, we'll get into the time and duration of return on investment. We'll look at the types of skills that are needed, whether it needs to be upskilled and reskilled for folks who have been around for a while, or getting the technology training in place for the next generation of worker. In my experience, it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. There's a skillful way to do this, and that's where I would be right now in these negotiations.
All right, we are talking with Gene Soroka, Executive Director of the Port of Los Angeles. I'm Carol Massar, along with Tim Stenovec here live on Bloomberg Business Week. Do want to mention a headline crossing. The Israel police updating the number of dead in that Tel Aviv attack to 6. So we continue to get some headlines following the launch of missiles, ballistic missiles by Iran. But there was also another direct attack in the area in Tel Aviv. So we're starting to get some more details about some of the casualties in that. And
yeah, that one is shooting.
Yeah, that was
earlier.
a shooting. Yeah.
Gene, I want to go back to Gene Soroka joining us from Los Angeles. Gene, economists are still trying to figure out how much damage to a supply chain this would do, what the economic cost would be. Estimates range from $1 billion to $5 billion a day in delayed or lost activity as a result of this strike, as a result of these strikes. Given your perch, given where you are, I'm wondering how long you think this strike will go on.
Yeah, Tim, that's an estimate of the average amount of cargo value that goes through these ports on a daily basis. Not all of it is perishable in the most clear sense. If this strike is very short, couple, 3 days, there's the ability to catch up on getting this commerce out to the interior of the country, to the consumer bases across the eastern seaboard very quickly. It's when it becomes a lot longer than just these several days that if it turns into weeks, we'll have a very different discussion right here on this show. The other piece to this is that this strike will impact someone somewhere, guaranteed. So whether it truly is a fruit or vegetable that's coming up from Central America, or it's a specific product that has to be sold by a particular date, that may go away forever. And it's the stock out for the retailer. It's the order that an individual put in that may not make it in time for their consumer. That's what goes away as well. But it's just not a flat number of $5 billion a day that will be eliminated from the United States economy if we can get these sides to reach agreement in a decent amount of time. And I would say that putting up pickets across 14 major ports will motivate some more than ever to get to the table.
So I want to just go back to wages and just got 30 seconds here. My understanding is the most recent offer from the United States Maritime Alliance was for a 50% wage increase. The workers wanted, I think, more like 68%, but forgive me if I've got that number wrong. It sounds like a lot, and I think if somebody hears that, it sounds like a lot. In just 30 seconds, is it that their pay was so low, or is that a pretty aggressive request? And just quickly, if you could.
I think the pay was a little bit low in keeping up with the gigantic income level jumps that you've seen in the shipping industry. This is an affordable quotient, but but there are details that have to be resolved.
All right, so appreciate all the time you've given us on this Tuesday. Gene Soroka, thank you so much. Gene is Executive Director at the Port of Los Angeles, joining us again from the West Coast, LA specifically.
Coming up next on Bloomberg Business Week, we're going to continue to bring you updates out of the Middle East as we continue our coverage right here on Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. A very busy day for U.S. markets. We're off session lows. Missiles fired at Israel. A dock workers strike on the east and Gulf coast of the United States. And a looming vice presidential debate. Investors are retreating to safer corners of the market after Iran fired a barrage of missiles at Israel. After Israeli forces pushed into southern Lebanon, the Israeli military said Iran fired more than 100 ballistic missiles directly at the country, an escalation in the battle between Middle Eastern rivals fought mainly so far through proxies. And moments ago, Iran state TV said Iran used hypersonic Fatah missiles in the Israel attack. A spokesman for the Israel Defense Forces said many of the missiles were intercepted, but that there were several hits in the south and central parts of the country. Crude oil rising today as tensions rise as well. West Texas Intermediate now up 3%, $70.22 a barrel. Brent, the global benchmark, up by 3.1%. U.S. stocks off session lows, but still a lot of red on the screen with the S&P down 35, now down 0.6%. The Dow down 25, down 0.1. NASDAQ is slumping by 1.8%. 10-year 3.74%. The 2-year 3.61%. Gold up 1.1%, 26.63 the ounce. And again, crude worth repeating, now higher by 3%. After the close of trading today, we will be hearing from Nike. Nike up by 1%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, thank you so much. As Charlie just mentioned, Iran launched an attack on Israel using ballistic missiles. Iranian state TV confirming that launch. The strike is the second direct attack by Tehran on Israel this year. Let's get right to Bobby Ghosh, senior editor at Bloomberg News. He has reported on and from the Middle East. He's here in our New York studio. I'm not even quite sure what the smart question is to ask you right now. I feel like we have had so many conversations. We're a year in. I don't know whether to say war. I don't know whether to say attack. I don't know whether to say escalation. You understand this region like no other. Where are we?
This is a very, very dangerous escalation. There's no question. These are ballistic missiles that are much faster and much more deadly than the ones that Iran fired off in the direction of Israel in April, I want to say. Back then, it was mostly cruise missiles and drones and rockets. This is a different level. Back then, they gave ample warning and allowing Israel to prepare for the incoming missiles. They were able to, I think there was only one of the Iranian missiles that harmlessly struck Israeli territory. This time it looks like there have been several missiles that have gone through the Iron Dome, and we don't know the extent of damage. This is a much, much more deadly attack. Also, we're hearing from some parts of the Iranian media that there'll be secondary and more attacks, that this is not a one-off. If some of those missiles have struck Israeli targets, if the Israeli lives have been lost, it's hard for me to imagine that Israel won't retaliate in some way. So we've been having several conversations about escalation, about a tipping point into a war. This is as close as we've ever been.
Well, let's talk about that tipping point. You can't see the future. None of us can see the future, but we know what's happened over the last year, Bobby. And I'm wondering to what extent you think there will be more of an escalation before there will be an end of this war. What does that look like to you?
I don't see an end of this war happening anytime soon. If anything, over the last 3 or 4 days, the scope of the war has greatly expanded. Now you have Israeli ground troops in Lebanon. The conflict with Hezbollah has greatly ramped up. And if Iran now wants to have a direct role, then this will become much, much worse. I can only imagine, this is a horrible cliche, but it is true, it will get a lot worse before it even begins to get better. And to answer your question, what does it look like at the end? We're so far into unknown territory now, I don't even dare speculate.
Who else gets drawn in? President Biden directed the U.S. military to aid Israel's defense against the Iranian attacks, shoot down missiles that are targeting Israel. That came from the National Security Council. They put that out on Twitter, X. So who else gets drawn in?
Well, we get drawn in. The United States is the most obvious party to this. As you say, the Biden administration we're already participating in the defense of Israel. The question is, if Iran continues second, third wave of attacks, then what the United States does. The Biden administration has flown in more jets into the region, more boots on the ground. That will continue to increase. The Arab neighbors, quite interestingly, the last time there was this barrage of rockets and drones from Iran, the Arab neighbors participated in blocking them off. Jordan particularly helped Israel at that time. This time, Jordan doesn't seem interested in doing that. It has announced the closure of its airspace to civilian aircraft, but it does not seem to be participating in preventing those rockets, even if it was capable of doing so, land in Israel. So I don't think Israel can count on its neighbors to help out this time, so it'll lean even more on the United States than before.
Bobby, we are awaiting a White House press briefing that is set to start any minute at this point, and I think we need to talk about this in the context of what it means for a U.S. election that is just over a month away. How do you view what's happening in the Middle East affecting the U.S. election?
Well, one of the constants of cliches about the U.S. election, October surprise. Here it is. This could be it. The Trump administration, the Trump campaign are already leaning into this with the usual bluster about this would have never happened under my watch. Well, actually, it did happen under Trump's watch. The Iranians, after Trump ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranians fired off more than a dozen missiles that left scores of American service personnel injured. So it did happen under Trump. But that is the line that he'll take. I'm the tough guy. And we'll see how the Harris campaign responds, whether she will now feel obliged to take a tougher line, more pro-Israel line, and she's been trying to balance within her own party this sensitivity about Israel and Palestine. There are many within her party that are very sympathetic to the Palestinian cause that would, and she's been taking a sort of she's been walking this balance where she's been talking about Israel's right to defend itself, but also calling for a ceasefire. If Iran gets involved, that kind of rhetoric will be much harder to parse for an American public ahead of an election.
We've got just about a minute before we expect this briefing at the White House. I am curious what you anticipate or what you'll be listening out for, or what are you, whether it's the White House or overseas, what is kind of the next thing that you think is really important to watch for?
I think the thing we'll be hearing the usual statements about Israel's right to defend itself, Iran should stay out of this, and threats that, that if Iran gets involved, there will be repercussions. I don't think the administration at this stage will want to draw any red lines. We've seen what happens when that kind of language is used. I don't think that Jake Sullivan will articulate what repercussions Iran may face or whether the United States will participate in those repercussions. But we'll definitely, I expect to see over the next even 24 hours, the Biden administration announcing more American men and hardware being sent to the region.
Bobby Ghosh, thank you so much. To the White House we go. Karine Jean-Pierre, the White House spokesperson, at the podium, and now it looks like Jake Sullivan up at the podium, National Security Advisor. Let's listen in.
Provide a brief report on the Iranian ballistic missile attack against Israel that occurred earlier today. I can take just a few questions because this is an ongoing situation and I need to get back to my desk. Today, Iran launched nearly 200 ballistic missiles towards targets in Israel. The United States military coordinated closely with the Israeli Defense Forces to help defend Israel against this attack. U.S. naval destroyers joined Israeli air defense units in firing interceptors to shoot down inbound missiles. President Biden and Vice President Harris monitored the attack and the response from the White House Situation Room, joined in person and remotely by their national security team. We are still working with the IDF and the authorities in Israel to assess the impact of the attack. But at this time, and I stress at this time, we do not know of any deaths in Israel. We are tracking the reported death of a Palestinian civilian in Jericho in the West Bank. We do not know of any damage to aircraft or strategic military assets in Israel. In short, based on what we know at this point, this attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. This was first and foremost the result of the professionalism of the IDF, but in no small part because of the skilled work of the U.S. military and meticulous joint planning in anticipation of the attack. We are also aware of reports of a terrorist attack in Jaffa that took the lives of a number of Israeli civilians and wounded several others today. Our condolences go out to the families of the victims and to the family of the Palestinian civilian in Jericho. Obviously, my update here is based on early reports, and we reserve the right to amend and adjust as necessary as we gather more information. The word fog of war was invented for a situation like this. This is a fluid situation. We will consult with the Israelis on next steps in terms of the response and how to deal with what Iran has just done, and we will continue to monitor for further threats and attacks from Iran and its proxies. We are particularly focused on protecting U.S. service members in the region. And with that, I'll take just a few questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Jake. Is the administration making any preparations to evacuate U.S. citizens from Lebanon or elsewhere in the region?
We have been very clear for some time now that U.S. citizens should avail themselves of commercial means to depart Lebanon, given everything that's going on. We have said that from this podium, from multiple podiums. We continue to say that, but we have not begun triggering a non-combatant emergency evacuation, a NEO, and do not have an intention to do so at this time. If that changes, we'll let you know. But we continue to reinforce the point. American citizens in Lebanon should follow the guidance from the State Department, which is to find civilian commercial means to depart, because in extremis, we may not be able to get them out safely. Yes.
Thanks, Jake. What is the U.S. view on whether Israel should retaliate, and what is your concern about this leading to a wider escalation of war in the region?
We've had some initial discussions with the Israelis in the aftermath of this at the military level and also at the White House to Prime Minister's office level. We'll continue those conversations in the hours ahead. I'm not going to prejudge or get ahead of anything. We want to have some deep consultations with the Israelis, and I'll have more to report to you after we get the opportunity for deeper discussions.
And escalation in the region?
Obviously, this is a significant escalation by Iran, a significant event, and it is equally significant that we were able to step up with Israel and create a situation in which no one was killed in this attack in Israel, so far as we know at this time. We are now going to look at what the appropriate next steps are to secure, first and foremost, American interests, and then to promote stability to the maximum extent possible as we go forward. Yeah.
Back in April, the president's message to Israel was to take the win when the U.S. and Israel were able to intercept the barrage of Iranian missiles. Is he recommending a similarly limited response this time?
I will not, from this podium, share the president's recommendations. He will have the opportunity to share them directly. We're going to have as early for me to tell you anything publicly in terms of our assessment or in terms of what our expectations are of the Israelis or the advice that we will give them.
So will he be speaking to Prime Minister Netanyahu today?
I don't have anything to announce from this podium, but I can tell you that he is tracking this minute by minute. We are very much deeply in touch with the Israelis, and insofar as we have calls to read out, we'll make sure to read them out with you. Just last question, then I'll turn it over.
Thank you, Jake. In April, after Iran struck Israel, the U.S. issued a number of sanctions as a consequence. This morning, the president said there would be severe consequences if Iran carried out this attack. What are those consequences, and are they more severe than sanctions?
Totally legitimate question, and that answer will come based on the conversations and consultations we have with our Israeli counterparts. It's too soon for me to stand before you today and give you an answer. What I can tell you is this. We are proud of the actions that we've taken alongside Israel to protect and defend Israel. We have made clear that there will be consequences, severe consequences for this attack, and we will work with Israel to make that the case. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jake.
All right, everybody, you've been listening to Jake Sullivan, of course, the National Security Advisor for the United States there at the White House. A press briefing, rather brief, but I feel like the key takeaway, talking about consulting with Israel on next steps, working with the IDF to assess the impact of the attack, and made clear that there will be consequences for this attack. He also said that obviously this is a significant escalation by Iran, and of course, Tim stressing certainly concerns when it comes to American interests and specifically the U.S. military.
Yeah, he did also, he was asked about what U.S. citizens in the region should do. He did say U.S. citizens should depart Lebanon using commercial means. They've been saying no emergency evacuation at this point. Once again, we just did hear from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan briefing the press and the American people from the White House.
Right, and confirming once again that the U.S. military coordinated to help defend Israel in this attack. If you are just joining us here on Bloomberg, the Israel military today said Iran Iran fired more than 100 ballistic missiles directly at the country, an escalation in the battle between the Middle Eastern rivals, fought mainly so far through proxies. Iranian state TV said the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps launched tens of ballistic missiles at Israel in retaliation for the killing of Hamas and Hezbollah leaders, and an Iranian general. It targeted important security and military sites, threatened more devastating attacks if Israel responded.
We also should note that when we did hear from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan at the White House just now, he was asked several questions about what President Biden's views on this were, if President Biden would speak to Prime Minister Netanyahu. He chose not to answer those questions and say, from this podium, I'm not going to talk about what the president is going to discuss or if he will have discussions and what his views on this are.
All right, well, safe to say that tonight, of course, the vice presidential debate, Bloomberg Radio and TV will simulcast the CBS News VP debate beginning at 8 p.m. Wall Street time on radio and television. Bloomberg News reporter Tyler Kendall, normally in our D.C. bureau, she will be in the spin room, and that is where we find her right now at CBS TV studios in Midtown, New York City. Tyler, you know, here we are. We've just spent the last 56 minutes talking about the Middle East. Once again, geopolitics, and specifically the Middle East, is front and center. What do we expect to hear from the candidates on that front?
Right, there is no doubt that foreign policy will now take center stage during the debate tonight. And part of a vice presidential debate, right, is to elevate the positions of the top of the ticket, that candidate. So, for example, we already know that former President Donald Trump has come out with a statement claiming that if he was president, there would be peace and maybe this wouldn't happen. You had been talking about this earlier this hour with Bobby Ghosh. And I would expect that there would be similar rhetoric when it comes to J.D. Vance tonight, because they kind of have this ability, right, to draw contrasts to the current administration and try to put forward their vision when it comes to what they would change in the administration. Now, for his part, Senator J.D. Vance on Capitol Hill has been a staunch defender of Israel. For example, he might be known for his opposition when it comes to aid for Ukraine, but he has repeatedly pushed for more aid when it comes to Israel, even pushing forward some specific bills himself that would clear the way for additional military assistance there. Now, on the Democratic side, we do know that the White House, as we just heard from Jake Sullivan, has said that Vice President Kamala Harris has been in and out of the Situation Room all day monitoring this situation. So it'll be interesting to see if Tim Walz tries to kind of tout her current experience with managing what's currently happening.
Tyler, we only have about a minute and a half left. Help us understand more broadly what's at stake tonight.
Right, well, this is the first and likely only time that these candidates are going to be meeting, and it's also potentially the last debate of this presidential cycle, which is just raising those stakes even higher. Today marks exactly 5 weeks until Election Day, so we know that both candidates are trying to kind of grab all of these last-minute undecided voters in this push ahead. Just quickly, while we are talking about foreign policy, I would say that domestic policy is also going to be, of course, a big topic on the debate stage tonight. We know that both of these candidates were chosen in part due to their ties to the Midwest, as both of these campaigns try to put forward this bid to grab some of those key voters in those key battleground states. I'd point you just lastly to our most recent Bloomberg News Morning Consult polling out last week, which shows us that currently Vice President Kamala Harris is leading former President Donald Trump by about 3 percentage points across those 7 key battleground states. So it's all coming down to the wire here. Of course, that's a very close within the margin of error. So we'll have to see how both candidates kind of thread the needle here, both on foreign policy, but also domestic issues.
All right, Tyler, going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Bloomberg News reporter Tyler Kendall, as we said, in the spin room at CBS Television Studios in New York City. Bloomberg Radio and Television will simulcast that debate beginning at 8 p.m. Wall Street time. So be sure to check out both of that. Having said that, quite an hour. Geopolitics, it was something at the end of the year that most investment folks said this is going to be front and center, and it certainly is on this Tuesday, October 1st. That's going to do it for Tim and me here on Bloomberg Business Week. We continue on radio. Coming up next on television, The Close. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Business Week. Insight from the reporters and editors who bring you America's most trusted business magazine. Plus, global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. Bloomberg Business Week with Carol Masser and Tim Stenivek on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, everybody, we are just 1 hour away from the closing bell. It's a little bit of a hectic day, to say the least. And once again, as we just said in the last hour, we talked so much about the Middle East geopolitics. Tim, front and center.
Yeah, no question. We're going to have the latest on Iran's ballistic missile attack on Israel in just a few minutes. It's not the only risk that investors are thinking about right now. We talked about with Gene Soroka, what's going on at the ports on the East Coast.
Right.
What about forecasting the economic future of the country, Carol, under Harris versus Trump? It's today's big take.
We always say when it comes to a presidential election, it's the economy, stupid. That's what matters to most
Don't
voters.
call me stupid.
Never, never. But for most voters, that's what it comes down to. Also, don't forget, we haven't quite kicked off the next earnings season officially, but we've got a big one after the closing bell. We're talking about Nike. What you need to know as the company undergoes a change at the top. There are a lot of changes at what many would say is the standard when it comes to sneakers and athleisure wear. So we'll see what they have to say after the close.
Also, no question, it's polarizing out there. A new book argues, though, that what divides us can actually bring us closer together. So kind of a paradox.
Yeah, kind of wild, right?
Yeah.
To see that.
Looking forward to seeing how that works.
All right, guys, let's get you going. Like we said, less than an hour to go until the close. Let's get a check on the trade and your top business stories. Here's, once again, Charlie.
Thank you very much indeed. A day of fast-moving developments in the Middle East as Iran fires missiles at Israel. We've got you covered. IDF saying some 180 missiles were fired in that Iran attack on Israel. Israel says the Iranian missiles were mostly intercepted. That word from IDF, Israel Defense Forces. The Palestinian Civil Defense says one person was killed in the Iran missile attack. In the meantime, Chevron has shut its Tamar and Leviathan platforms as a precaution. Investors are retreating to safer corners of the market after Iran fired that barrage of missiles at Israel. Haven assets gaining with bonds, oil, gold, and the U.S. dollar all advancing. Stocks are dropping. Right to the equity market with the S&P down 38 right now, 57.24. Where we stand now, a drop of 0.7%. Dow Jones Industrial Average down 65, a decline of 0.1%, while the NASDAQ Composite Index is down by 1.2%. 10-year at 3.73%, the 2-year 3.61%. Gold is surging 1%, 26.61 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude oil rallying 2.8%, 70.10 for a barrel of WTI. Off-session highs have been up by as much as 5%. Welcome to the fourth quarter, first trading day of October, and a time of the year that Carol Schleif, the Chief Investment Officer at BMO Family Office, calls the spooky season.
I think a piece of it is just structurally, as people come to the end of the year, you also get in that fall quarter, you can get people doing some early tax loss harvesting and things like that. So, and also there's just that institutional memory, if you will, of the 1987 crash. So many crashes that happened in September, October.
Schleif was interviewed this morning on Bloomberg Television. The day's other major story, dock workers walked out of every major port on the U.S. East and Gulf Coast for the first time in nearly 50 years. Among shipping stocks, AP Møller-Mærsk, the ADR is down 5% right now. They are based in Denmark. Out of Germany, Hapag-Lloyd ADR is down now by 4.7%. Recapping, S&P down 0.7%, WTI crude up 2.8%. For on-demand news, 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thanks so much for that update, Charlie Pellet. Our coverage of the Middle East and what's happening in the Middle East continues. Iran launching an attack on Israel using ballistic